Okay, I'd like to get started shortly. I have you all muted, so maybe somebody can just wave their hand. Everybody's hearing me okay? Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Karen Sheldrick. I'm the General Manager of the Niagara Construction Association. Welcome to the 6th Annual Safety Awareness Day. Thank you for joining us today. Historically, our Niagara Safety Awareness Day has been a free community-based in-person event to share and create awareness of construction safety. It was a great opportunity to check out products on display at the trade show, participate in demonstrations, gain education from industry experts, and improve health and safety within your workplace. We held the event virtually last year due to COVID, and from popular demand, decided to keep the format and continue the conversation. Safety in the construction industry has never been more important than it is now. We are very fortunate to have educated special guest speakers here to inform us today. Some housekeeping rules first. We automatically have all participants except the speaker muted to prevent any accidental interruptions. At the end of each session, we will hold a question and answer period. Please use your chat option to type in your questions. If we run out of time, please be assured we'll get an answer for you and we'll reply by email later. The session will be recorded and available after the event ends. A quick shout out of thanks to Natalie, NCA Administrative Assistant, for tracking our many registrations, and our safety committee members for assisting us in planning this event this afternoon. I'll mention them to you quickly. NCA Safety Chair, Melanie Patterson, Walker Environmental Group. Melanie, give a wave, that's great. Jack McKernan, former long-term director on the NCA board. John Downing and Graham Scott from Rankin Construction. Michael Langlois, Langlois Safety Training and Consulting Services. Jacqueline Nickel, Peninsula Construction, Inc. Zach Shipper of Merit Contractors, Niagara, and Kelly Gonzalez from Cotton, who will introduce our first guest speaker. Kelly, I'm just going to go ahead and unmute you here.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Michael Langlois is a licensed industrial woodworker who's worked on many construction projects. In 2005, he became a health and safety professional for one of the largest employers in the Niagara region. 2009, he's completed his occupational health and safety certificate program from Ryerson University and received his Canadian Registered Safety Professional designation. In 2010, he received a certificate of ergonomic specialist. In 2012, he completed the Osgoode Hall Law School Certificate of Workplace Health and Safety Law. 2014, he received his Certified Health and Safety Consultant designation from the Canadian Society of Safety Engineering and opened his health and safety training company called Langlois Safety Training and Consulting Services. In 2016, he's completed the Osgoode Hall Law School Certificate of Workplace Mental Health Law. Michael is currently completing his Diploma of Occupational Health and Safety from the University of New Brunswick. Langlois Safety Training and Consulting Services are a Chief Prevention Office approved training provider for Working at Heights, Joint Health and Safety Committee Part 1 and Part 2, and the refresher. They have a training facility in St. Catharines where they offer Working at Heights, Joint Health and Safety Committee training, elevated work platform, both scissor and boom, which they have at their facility, confined space rescue, self-contained breathing apparatus, telehandler, forklift, WMIS, and much more. They also offer online training from their website as well. There you go, Michael.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Really appreciate it. All right, so I'm just going to put up my presentation here. Sorry, I'm going to have to do this first. I am new to this, so my apologies. There we go. All right. We're going to do this. All right. Can everybody see my screen okay? All right. Good. So everybody does not see to the right where everybody is right now, I take it? Is that correct? No? All right, good. All right, so yes, we're going to be talking about orientation, value, and necessity of safety training. So this is really important. So yeah, when we go through this, what I tried to do is make this relevant to all of you and put things into perspective when it comes to the money that you're spending on training, why it's so important, and the benefits that you're going to get by, of course, doing that safety training. And so as we go through this presentation, I'm hoping to get you a little bit engaged, think about how you're currently structured in your organization. And certainly that will facilitate perhaps some questions at the end that we can have some further discussion about. So one of the first things I wanted to do is have a look at where money is being spent when it comes to health and safety specifically, not necessarily just training. And so there's this great study that was done in 2017 by the Institute for Work and Health and Safety. And basically what they wanted to do is determine where is the money being spent for all employers in Ontario. But as you can see here, what we're going to focus on predominantly is going to be the construction sector, obviously. And so what they did is they got 334 employers. And out of those 334 employers, you can see there under the N to the right of construction, that there were 30 employers from construction that basically gave the IWH their information so that they could do this study. So in order to qualify for it, first of all, they were randomly selected. But one of the caveat was, of course, that they had to have a minimum of 20 people working for their particular company as well, too. So that means 20 plus. So that could mean anywhere from 20 to, a very large construction company that may have several hundred people working for them. And of course, what they wanted to see is exactly what is being spent on health and safety per worker per year. Now, there were 17 sectors represented there. The one that construction falls in is this one here, which is called goods producing sector. And that's really important to recognize that, because there's also another sector as well too, which is the service sector. And out of the service sector, remember we said there's 334 employers that participated. Well, obviously we had 97 in the goods producing there that you see under the N. So that meant 234 came from that service sector group there. So when you look at this, what you'll notice is that construction had the second highest, money spent on health and safety, per person per year than any other group other than mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction. So which is quite significant, because even when you look at the highest number that was within the service sector, still construction end up being 2.5 times more than the highest dollar value that was associated for the service sector. So quite interesting when you look at this data to see exactly what is being spent, and that's what we're going to do right now. So as you can see there was a total of $3,626 per person per year that was spent on health and safety. And so the way this study worked is that they looked at 5 dimensions, and those dimensions were organizational management and supervision, it was staff training and health and safety, it was personal protective equipment, and then of course professional services, and of course new capital investment as well too was included in those 5 economic sectors, or 5 dimensions that we have here. So now what we're going to do is take a look at how much did the average employer, and it was interesting about this article because what it said was it was pretty consistent. The data didn't move very much between employer to employer, and when it averaged it out, most employers were falling within the numbers that you're seeing on the screen right here. And that is that 58% spent their health and safety budget, so to speak, on organizational management and supervision. 22% spent it on staff training and health and safety, 14% to personal protective equipment. And as it mentions there, less than 5% to each of the professional services and new capital investments. So for professional services, it ended up being somewhere around 2%, and new capital investment was somewhere around 3%. But for the sake of what we're doing here, we're just going to say that, you know, it's 5% for those two groups when we group them together. So organizational management and supervision, what actually falls under that particular category? Well, as you can see here, it is the proportion of time. So a share of the full-time equivalent spent on health and safety by the most senior person responsible for health and safety and any support staff that may have supported that individual as well too. And of course, we can't forget about our Joint Health and Safety Committee. So what they looked at was the number of members, the frequency, the duration of meetings, the number of hours per year that the committee members spent on workplace inspections, and of course, the number of supervisors in the organization and an estimate of the annual percentage of time each supervisor devoted to monitoring compliance with the organization's health and safety policies. So when you take a look at, as an example, a staff of 20, if that was the minimum representation that would have been there for the 30 construction companies that were selected for this, you would see that based on that number that we had previously, that would work out to approximately $2,100 a year per person, which works out to about $42,000 a year. So you're probably saying to yourself, okay, listen, you know, a full-time person in health and safety for a company of only 20 people, probably highly unlikely. It's still possible, but probably unlikely. But keeping in mind the demographic had to have a minimum of 20. We don't know the representation of how large some of these companies were. So some of them certainly did have a representation of someone who is dedicated to health and safety. But in many cases, there may just be a supervisor who has part of their role. And of course, if that's part of their role, they wouldn't be able to use the total value of that individual for an entire year if their primary duty was as a supervisor. So when you put that into perspective, I mean, think about your own organization, and when you're thinking about how much do you spend per person per year, and take a look how much staff you have. Good representation of where a typical employer would be is somewhere around that $2,100 a year per person. And of course, staff training. So what they looked at was the time and resources to provide health and safety training to new and regular staff, which included an estimated count of trainees each year, the number of hours spent on health and safety orientation for new individuals, and of course, retraining as well too. So what was the estimate of the cost per person per year for construction? Well, you can see here, it basically worked out to $800 a year per person that was being spent on health and safety training for a typical construction project. So think about this though, if you've got a new employee, you have to do your worker health and safety awareness. You're probably going to look at WMIS, you're working on heights, you're helping with platforms, your confined space, maybe lockout, tagout, maybe first aid. Of course, you're going to have to train them on your company policies and procedures, right? And in addition to that, you may have to include things like AODA or slip, trips, and fall prevention, workplace violence and harassment training as an example. And something that might be coming forward in the near future, once a date has been established, is the naloxone use and administration. So these are things that, when you think about that $800 a year per person, that's a pretty small number to think about for someone who's new to the organization. Keeping in mind that most cases, a lot of this training, the ministry is kind of established through Working in Heights, through Joint Health and Safety Committee, that a refresher needs to occur about once every 3 years. And so as a result of that, if we look at that, when you take a new employee orientation or existing staff, they do not need to receive all that training I mentioned on an annual basis. However, some of that training would have to be refreshed on certain intervals. And so that dollar value would certainly correspond a little bit more correctly to what you're probably seeing within your particular organization. So again, if we take a look at the minimum representation of a staff of 20, you'd be looking at a company-wide commitment of approximately $16,000 per year that you would be spending on health and safety. So, you know, when you look at, compare that to your particular organization that you are represented right now from by being here, is that number close to where you are at, or does it supersede exactly the number that you that we're talking about here? And of course, we also have to talk about personal protective equipment, right? So again, you know, this has never been more important than certainly what we've seen in the last couple of years. But what they did is they looked at the number of units, the estimated unit cost of personal protective equipment purchased in a typical year, and by type of equipment. So in this picture, what do we see? We see an individual that is wearing a hard hat. You can see that we have a tearaway safety vest. We've got a harness on. We've got a energy absorbing lanyard that they're wearing. What we don't see is the fact that they would need their safety shoes, as an example, or safety boots, I should say. And in addition to that, probably things like glasses, perhaps hearing protection, you know, perhaps work gloves that may be within that individual's pocket. Certainly, you know, lots of other things that might be required is, especially during COVID, is things like medical masks, right? We certainly had to, as employers, to make those available to our staff as well too. And there are going to be instances where we might have to do things like get them to wear half face piece respirators or full face piece respirators, which isn't just the cost of the equipment, but it's also the cost of doing either qualitative or quantitative fit testing. And, you know, as a company that offers that as a service, I can just say that the equipment to do this is quite expensive, right? So when we're talking about using, you know, whether it's qualitative and using hoods, or whether you're using, you know, what we have, which is a port account and a QuantiFit, which are quantitative, those are very expensive pieces of equipment that are going to typically cost you somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000, plus about $1,500 to $2,000 of annual calibration fees. So, of course, when you send somebody to have some of those quantitative fit testing done, obviously there's going to be associated costs that have to go along with that as well too. And of course, we have to remember that when you look at that number of $475 a year per person, keeping in mind that some of that equipment does not have to, you know, does not need to be changed every year. I mean, if you're taking a look at that, I can see that individual is probably wearing somewhere around a $200 to $250 harness, probably $120 energy absorbing lanyard. By the time you factor all the PPE that we just talked about, that could certainly run you into, you know, numbers well exceeding $1,000 a year. But keeping in mind that a lot of that equipment, such as that harness and other pieces of equipment that individual is wearing, certainly could see several years of use out of it before it needs to be, you know, before it needs to be replaced, right? So that's certainly, if you want to put things once again into perspective, if you have a staff of 20, that's going to represent approximately about $9,500 a year that would be spent just on personal protective equipment. Sorry, I don't know why it's going the wrong direction. All right, so as far as professional services and new capital investment, certainly what we're talking about here is hiring external consulting services, right? So in other words, you know, bringing someone in to audit our health and safety policies and procedures, right? So there's lots of great companies out there that do those kind of things. As an example, that's a service we offer. But you know, you're going to hear from Ella shortly as she delivers her presentation, and she has a wealth of experience when it comes to offering these kind of consulting services to audit an organization. And just so you're aware, there are financial incentives by doing that. And so it's certainly something to look at as well too. And in addition to that, we have new capital investment as well too. So what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about renovated facilities, acquired capital equipment. Again, what they do is they take a look how long would the lifespan be of that particular piece of equipment, and then that's where they are going to make sure that that is considered in the price that that comes up on a per person per year basis. However, the caveat here is that it had to that capital expenditure had to be for the improvements in worker health protection, right? So during COVID, perhaps you put in a ventilation system in your staff room, as an example, or perhaps you did other upgrades. These are the types of things that would end up there. Perhaps you have a piece of equipment where the air conditioning or the heating has not been working correctly on it, and those were things that would have to be spent in order to protect the workers' health. Then these would be things that would actually be qualified for that to make that particular number. And so those are the two categories that work out to about $251 per year per person. So once again, if we take that in perspective and say if I had a staff of 20, that would be represented to about $5,020 a year. And if we use the original number, which was somewhere approximately 2% for external consulting services, that means you'd be spending somewhere around $2,008 a year for professional services and about $3,012 a year for new capital investment, right? So we can see that it certainly is the least of these, but you can see why this is so important when we look at the numbers. So thinking about that, how does your organization, how do they measure up based on the numbers that we saw? Are you meeting or exceeding some of those numbers? Are you perhaps a little bit shy of some of the numbers that are there? Well, you know what, that's for you to decide and look at the numbers that you currently have within your organization. But now the $1 million question we want to know is, okay, is it worth my while? Am I going to see a return on that investment of approximately $3,600 a year per person spent on occupational health and safety? Well, let's take a look at the 7 reasons why training can improve your workplace. The first thing is that it does create a culture of safety. And, you know, that strong internal responsibility system is an important element of that safety culture. And again, that safety culture shows respect for people in the workplace. And I can't stress that enough, is that, you know, as a working at heights provider, one of the key things that the ministry wanted to see from all their CPO approved training providers is that when we did theory, they wanted to see that we built into that culture of safety into our presentations. And again, one of the reasons why is we see a lot of fatalities within construction, within working at heights. And certainly, they wanted to stress the importance of everybody looking after one another, right? So that it's not just my supervisor's job to keep me safe, it's my job to keep me safe. And if I see one of my colleagues doing something inappropriate, that I would stop them from doing those kind of things. So certainly, you know, it's so important that that we look at those kind of things. And, you know, and again, keeping in mind where the vast majority of companies in Ontario, the fatalities that are happening, the vast majority of them are not just happening from someone getting injured from a fall and dying as a result of that, or those traumatic injuries. The vast majority of them are actually happening through occupational illness exposures, right? So we can't lose lose sight of the fact that most people are dying from exposures. So especially during times where COVID, whether I work with asbestos, silica, you know, any of these types of things, certainly when people look after one another, that's always going to be preferred as well too. All right, and decreased turnover, right? So we know that a happy employee is a productive employee. Well, you know, that's the challenge we're running into right now, is that between March 2017 and September 2017, the ministry had established the Working at Heights deadline. First it was April 1st, and then they had to move that because there just wasn't, a lot of companies left it to the last minute. And as a result of that, most people had that 6-month window so that they could do their Working at Heights because there weren't enough training providers to provide it. And so as a result of that, think back, you know, it has to be redone every 3 years. So that means during that same time period of March 2017 to September 2017, we should actually have had the vast majority of people requiring to work in heights coming due right around that time of March 2020 onward. So, the ministry even had a meeting with us and said, listen, there's going to be so many people that require this. Are you going to be able to handle this? What are you prepared to do? And of course, we all gave our CPO the ideas of the things that we were willing to do to try and support this. The fact of the matter is that we're doing just as many full Working Heights sessions as we are Working Heights Refresher. And that's quite surprising to me, given the fact that we should be seeing a lot more of that. And so, I've reached out to perhaps even some of you that are here right now. And I've asked them that question: why are we seeing so many individuals in our full course versus a lot of our refreshers? And, some of the responses I've had is, while some of these individuals were laid off during COVID, some of them chose to accept government benefits instead of returning. Some left the construction industry altogether. Some applied to other jobs in the construction elsewhere. So certainly we all recognize that in construction, there is a shortage of staff working in construction. So really retaining qualified staff has never really been any more important than it is right now. So that's why it's so important that we look at that. And of course, better support your staff. Why is that important? Because, during the training process, you might identify someone who's really struggling with perhaps a particular concept. And that's why things like job-specific training is so important, right? I mean, when we do training here, and we do a lot of training out of our 3,000 square foot training facility here, a lot of times we will identify people that are really good at what they do, really good. And we'll actually pick up the phone, we'll call that company, these are, we've built relationships with them and say, you know what, this individual did really well. They listened well, they participated well, they did well in the tests. This looks to me at this point in time to be a very good hire, right? But on the flip side, occasionally we end up with someone in the course who we're very concerned about, right? Someone who, despite our best efforts to spend the time with them, and they might have just passed by the skin of their teeth, so to speak, right? Where they're just, barely got through, and we're very concerned about it. And so we'll pick up the phone and we'll call that company and just say, this is an individual that is going to require job-specific training, right? And we always give that same advice to everyone: is spend the time with them, help them remove those barriers. I mean, I can't stress that enough, and how important removing those barriers is going to be to make that person successful. And that's where the job-specific safety training, and keeping in mind, it is cyclical, right? So, it is not just one-time thing, it is ongoing. And that's including for your existing staff who perhaps have been there many years. And at some point, you may have to make that determination that this person is too much of a risk because they don't get the concepts of health and safety. And sometimes you might have to look at, things such as, looking at progressive discipline up to including termination for those individuals. What it also does is improves communication, right? And, I can't stress how important this really is as someone who used to be a supervisor of a large group of staff, over 100 staff. It's certainly, when you find a hazard and you go to the people who are going to do the work and they come up with some of the best ideas, that the only reason they come up with those kind of things is there's that ability to trust, right? That's where that safety culture comes into play, where I feel comfortable enough with you, my supervisor, to tell you, hey, by the way, supervisor, as soon as you leave, here's what happens on the construction project when you go over here. This is what's happening. People don't typically do things they know their supervisor is going to see them do. They're inappropriate. They wait till the supervisor's left, right? And when you have that culture of safety where it's about, let's keep everybody safe here, because you have to remember, a lot of times you are the constructor, and you're going to be responsible for people that are not from your respective company. These are going to be contractors and subcontractors that are working for you as the constructor. And sometimes that's where a lot of the issues arise. And that's why, again, it's not just about the, injury, it's also about the occupational illness exposures as well, too. And of course, it saved money on training. So yeah, that's really important. Yeah, you can go out and probably Google some things, find a PowerPoint perhaps, or purchase a PowerPoint. But ultimately, you also need not just have a training program, you need to also be able to have the equipment to go along with that, right? So as an example, in the picture here, we see a boom being used over our training facility. As mentioned at the beginning there, we talked about the fact that we have a scissor and a boom here. And, you know, it's, if you, a lot of construction companies may not have both those pieces of equipment, or may not have either, because they tend to rent their equipment. Well, you know, that does represent cost when you've got to rent a machine to bring it in for the day of training. And sometimes, believe it or not, it would be a lot cheaper just to send them to someone who is able to do all that training at their facility. And so that's, you know, one way to look at it. Plus, by having both pieces of equipment here, we get to train them on both pieces. And so there's some advantages to that. The challenge is, and this is where education comes into play, we need to educate ourselves when it comes to saving money on training costs. And here's what I mean by that. I had an individual who called us a few weeks ago. They had done an online training sessions on BWPs. And that individual wanted us to do the practical evaluations. Of course, we said, no, we got to do our theory and then the practical evaluations. So that individual ended up having to book the entire course because they did an online training that was absolutely of no use to them whatsoever. So, you know, therein lies the problem. And the challenge you run into is very high-risk activities, things like confined space, right? Very high-risk activities. A lot of things can go bad. This Saturday, I trained 5 individuals from five different companies. And those individuals, because we have a confined space tank, because we have a tripod, retrieval device, because we have a confined space meters here, we have the cal gases to be able to do bump test, all of those types of things. We get everybody to do a confined space permit. Those individuals left feeling comfortable with the training so that when they go to do their first confined space entry or as an attendant, they will now have the skill set available for them to be able to do what they have to do. So there's definitely money savings to be had when it comes to that. And of course, you know, you want to keep your production active, right? So I'm not going to spend too much time on this here because we do understand from the session that we're going to listen to from Brian Barron and of course from Lisa Bolton why this is so important, because obviously when an accident happens, you know, the ministry is going to be there, the police perhaps are going to be there, and certainly at the end of it, there's going to be production issues during that particular process. And of course, we want to reduce our absenteeism and injury costs. So why is this so important? Well, you know, in this case here, that individual who has obviously fallen and injured themselves, you know, that individual could be off for several days as a result of that, or in some cases, several months, depending on the severity of it. We have a slide that we ask people during working at heights about anyone in the room been in a fall or know someone that has. And we've heard all types of stories throughout. And one consistent thing that I always ask them is, how long was that individual off for? Because I want the people in the room to hear it. And in almost every single case, some of these events last for the remainder of their life in some cases, right? So it's really important that people understand that. But continuing on about this, obviously, we want to make sure that we don't just meet our legal requirements. You know, some people view it as, well, I got to spend money on training, you know, it's cutting my profit. But I'm going to show you that, believe it or not, spending money on it can actually be very profitable. And so that's exactly what we're going to do, because the return on investment on accident prevention, you know, is certainly going to be able to show that you know, based on direct and indirect costs, the average number of days for lost time days in construction is about 11.5 days. And that's from WSIB, and that's the 2020 data. So that's quite significant when you think about it. So basically, you've lost that individual for approximately 12 days where they're not at work, right? And that's 12 days without any kind of production that you've lost as a result of that. What's interesting is that there was, I'm sure many of you will remember CSAO, Construction Safety Association of Ontario. They've now been amalgamated into IHSA. But they did a report, and again, it was back to 1999 when they did this this report that they did that came out a couple of years later in 2001. And what they found is that the average claim cost for a critical injury with surgery and rehab was a minimum of $35,000. And so, obviously, whenever you look at something like that, it does impact your future profits, right? Since that is obviously going to have a financial burden on the organization. So, and the thing is, you have to remember is that these injury costs are subtracted from a contractor's bottom line profit. It can be depreciated, it can be written off as a business losses or deducted as an expense. And to offset a $50,000 in loss from an injury or illness or damage will make a 3%, for a company that makes about 3% profit, means that you're going to have to make an additional $1.6 million in services to regain that money. So that is quite significant when you think about it. And as well too, you're probably saying to yourself, well, the medical expenses, ambulance, hospital, doctor's fees, all those kind of things, that's covered by WSIB. I don't have to worry about that. Yes, that's true. But in addition to that, keeping in mind that you very well could see premium increases. There could be litigation depending on the situation. And certainly if the ministry comes along, they could certainly levy fines against you as well too. And as well too, the costs and disrupted work schedules, lost productivity, the cleanup, repair, the hiring and training replacement workers, the bad publicity. Imagine being listed on the ministry's website under the court bulletin section where you are listed there for having that critical injury fatality. You know what? There's some companies that will not even allow you to bid on certain jobs if that's the case, right? So certainly that is definitely going to affect your ability to your bottom line for sure. And what they found in that report that was done by the CSAO is that the average ratio of indirect to direct costs in Ontario construction is about 5 to 1. So that definitely has an impact and usually results in lost profits for the organization. So last two slides, because I realize I'm a couple minutes over here. But in conclusion, as you can see on the left there, the accident rates versus the percentage of safety investment. You can see there are financial advantages. This came from a peer-reviewed journal called Safety Costs Money and Can Save Money. And as it mentions here, that it can be improved with higher costs and slower schedules. Workplace injuries account for 69% of project costs, whereas an effective health and safety program accounts for only about 2.5% of those costs. And the higher the safety investment in a project, the lower the injury rates and the higher the profit. And of course, increased training, more frequent inspections, more health and safety meetings, having your supervisors, involved in the process and monitoring workers. All of these lead to fewer lost time injuries. So in conclusion, orientation, so important, especially with your new employees, right? It is a requirement for all workplaces in Ontario. People have to be retrained though. So are we doing that when it's necessary? Are we giving that site-specific orientation whenever, with someone? And of course, we have to remember that we have to orient all staff, subcontractors, visitors, with the use of site-specific orientation. And we have to remember not to forget that. And of course, the value, it saves money. There's a return on your investment when you train. And of course, it is the necessity of safety training. It helps meet your legislative requirements. It tells your staff that you care about them, right? It retains them. They want to work for you and establish that safety culture where everybody wants to work. And that is it for me.
Thanks, Michael. Does anybody have any questions for Michael? If you do, you can type them down in the chat box down below. We'll allow a couple minutes to see if any questions come through. Looks like you have a quick escape there, Michael. Thank you so much. At this time, I'd like to call on Zach Schipper to introduce our next speaker.
All right. Ella Davies is the president of Safety Works Consulting, Inc., an Ontario-based firm. She is a consultant with 20 plus years of health and safety management system development and implementation over numerous sectors. Ella is an ISO registered lead auditor with Exemplar Global, with specialties in injury management and OHS management system audits. Ella is a judge for Canada's Safest Employer Awards, second year in a row. She has been pleased to partner with the Niagara Construction Association for a long time on the delivery of Gold Seal courses. Ella's company is a WSIB approved provider for the WSIB Health and Safety Excellence Program and has partnered with the NCA to provide this to the membership. Everyone, please welcome Ella Davies.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so here we go. Thanks a lot, Zach. That was very good for you, very kind of you to share that. That's fabulous. So I'm just going to take us over here to where we need to be. And off we go. So again, thank you so much, Karen, for permitting me to come back and torture people again for yet another year. Thank you so much for that. So here we are. We have another Safety Awareness Day, and it's great because I can see some of my members have signed up for this. So terrific. They are probably so fed up with hearing from me that you guys can snooze through this if you need to. So there's a couple of things I'm going to be talking to you about. WSIB, everybody's absolute not favorite entity, and employer perspectives with regard to injuries. Just some reminders of things that you need to do. Most of you already know what to do, but hopefully there'll be a couple of things that just jog your memory on this. Injury management obstacles. Yes, we've got obstacles. And then I'd also like to just talk briefly about the OEA, the Office of the Employer Advisor, and the role that they could play in assisting, especially smaller businesses. So we'll start out with the WSIB, everyone's absolute favorite topic to not talk about. So obviously, if you have an injured worker, or when you do, and let's hope you don't have an injured worker, but if you did have an injured worker, the first thing that's probably going to be applied would be first aid. And as a reminder, don't forget to mark down on your treatment log, or whatever it is that you call it, whatever it is that's being used from a kit. Now, one word of caution would be that when you use the first aid kit, you do not report that on a Form 7 to the WSIB. I remember years ago, one of the members said that they were having an awful trouble at that time getting, the WISA report, the Workplace Injury Summary Report from WSIB, because when they received it, oh my goodness, it showed that they had so many injuries. But when I started to look through it with them, we found out that they'd actually been reporting every single first aid. Well, WSIB obviously didn't seem to care that much about that. And I guess they thought, well, if you're going to fill in a Form 7, we'll count it against you. So do remember that for Form 7, for first aid, that's not reportable to the WSIB using a Form 7. The one advantage of having it marked down would be that if somebody does something, they use something out of the first aid kit, they continue to work, there's no issue at all. If there does become an issue, at least there's a record somewhere that says that they did have an issue that's related to the workplace. So as soon as you have an injured worker, the first thing to do, obviously, is to get them off for some level of medical. That in itself presents some obstacles. People will tell you, but it's my 5-year-old's birthday. I plan to do this, this, and this. At the end of the day, getting them in for medical and getting them in for medical right away is absolutely imperative. I liken it to taking a cruise. So if you take a cruise and you've got a crappy captain at the helm, you're probably not going to have a great cruise. But if you act as if you're the captain of the ship, you're going to make sure that you have a successful outcome at the end of this. One of the other main reasons why you want them to go off for medical immediately and seek it is so that way you have some concept of what the restrictions and the limitations would be when you go to offer the modified work. So getting that Form 7 is imperative, but I will caution you, some medical facilities are not very forthcoming at all in providing that form, the Form 8. They're not very forthcoming in getting that to you. Regardless, you still have reporting obligations for the Form 7, whether or not you have a Form 8 in place. So there's also a thing called the Form 6 as well. Oftentimes, that's really ignored a lot and only usually becomes, usually when WSIB requests it. But I, as members, you already know, I strongly encourage that you get a Form 6 completed as soon as the worker injures themselves. You don't want this filled in down the road days later, months later. Why would you do that? Because this is the worker's account of what took place. And so it's vitally important that we get the worker's point of view of what happened. Better now, earlier, at the beginning of an injury, rather when they've had an opportunity to think about it. That return to work plan, most of you, I'm quite sure, already have some type of a form that's available. It explains, for instance, what the modified duties could be, what the restrictions or limitations would be as well. But do make sure you get that return to work plan done immediately. What do I mean by immediately? Well, when you start to work on that Form 7, that return to work plan actually should be done earlier than that Form 7. Again, if you have a form in place, it makes it so much easier because then all you have to do is really fill in the blanks. And hopefully, if you do get a Form 8, then that'll make it easier for you to determine what are those modified duties going to be. WSIB is not very accepting these days of verbal commitments to modified work. Everything needs to be in writing. Whether or not the worker chooses to sign that return to work offer or not is actually irrelevant. The fact is, are you as an employer or as the employer's rep, are you actually producing that document, something for them at least to have access to review? If the worker refuses to sign the return to work form, it's quite simple. Don't get your knickers in a twist. Just treat it like, okay, they're not going to sign, but do make sure you mark on there that they have declined, not the use of the word declined and not the use of the word refused. Just mark on there that they have declined to sign up. The big thing is to make sure that that return to work offer is actually made, very much so on a timely basis. So there's the Form 7. So first of all, we've got the Form 8. Hopefully, fingers crossed, that comes from the medical care provider. Then in addition to that, we're also going to get that Form 6 to the worker to complete. And then we've got the Form 7, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. This is the form that you will fill out as the employer, as the employer's representative. And on it, you're going to put down what the worker says happens. But do be aware that sometimes the worker will say it's A, but maybe the supervisor or the foreman tells you it's B. If there is that dissension, if it takes place, do make sure that you mark it down. There's this fabulous page 4. Page 4 is completely blank. But on that page, you can add some really vital information in there to provide clarification. How many days did the worker miss? Were there any challenges at all? It's a great page to actually use. But do keep in mind that the worker will also, by law, is entitled to a copy of the Form 7, as you are a copy of the Form 6. So if there is that dissenting view, so you've got two different versions of events, it is imperative that you get statements from people. Now, I know that a lot of you will probably say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to, I'll make the statement up and then I'll say it's from so-and-so. But really, it really helps out a lot if you can encourage the individual that has information to actually put it in their own words and their own handwriting. Anyway, there's this nasty little area of the Form 7. Most of you have already seen this, and it's called Section C6. Now, what it says in there, and for this, normally one needs like a magnifying glass to read it, but what it says in there is tell us what happened. So the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And more often than not, we're inclined to write, Bob slipped on, I don't know, banana peel or something like that. But really, we need to provide a lot more explanation in there. one of the key parts is to explain that this is what Bob said, or Bob indicated that. One of the things we don't want to do is put it in there as a statement of fact. When you put in there, Bob slipped on a banana peel, then you're agreeing with the fact that that's exactly what happened. When the reality is, it may be something quite different. The problem is if you put it in there as a statement of fact, trying to change that afterwards is virtually impossible. And it really does present a huge problem, because really what you're saying is, yeah, I know I put that in there, but now I mean something different. So it requires an awful lot of work to try and reverse anything that you put in or state as direct fact. So just be aware of that. Section C6 is something in particular that I hone right into, because again, you always want to say that this is what the worker has told you. Basically, you're leaving the opportunity there to say, you know what, I need to check this out and verify this. But whatever it is that we do, an immediate response obviously is best, and that would include the documentation. So again, you've got the Form 7, that's something that you would fill in. Then there's the Form 6, that's for the worker. And then obviously the Form 8 that comes from the medical care provider or whoever it is that attends medically. Now, I want to be abundantly clear about this. There's massive confusion around the Form 7. The Form 7 must be completed within 3 calendar days of knowing of an injury. But it doesn't have to be to WSIB until the 7th business day. So that means if an injury takes place on a Friday, then that Form 7 should be completed on the Monday. That also means you might want to hand the worker off a copy of the Form 7. But you have time to be able to gather other information. That other information, for instance, you may choose not to put it on the Form 7 specifically. Again, the worker's entitled to a copy of it, but you may also wish to do that as a subsequent submission as well. So you do have 7 business days to get that form into WSIB. Obviously, if you work 24/7, then yeah, you've got seven days because you're working every day. That Form 6, get it done as soon as possible. I've years ago had a situation where a worker didn't complete a Form 6, then completed it months later. And the worker wrote on it, it was a beautiful sunny day. There was no foreboding of the events that would happen to me. The birds were tweeting in the trees. Like, seriously? Seriously? Big problem with that was that the gentleman was actually illiterate. So how he came up with this wonderful prose, who knows? Obviously, he didn't write it. But we've given the opportunity. We want that information as fast as possible. The Form 8 is your first port of call medically to receive information on how to manage that injured worker's injury. But don't forget, you've got your FAFs or your functional abilities forms. Those, I believe, should be filled in every 2 to 3 weeks. And they could be filled in by anybody who is providing subsequent care to the worker. So for that, it's vitally important that you stay on top of it, that you make sure that you get that functional abilities form. That contains some fabulous information on how that worker is progressing throughout their injury. So I've thrown these words at medical care providers. So who on earth are medical care providers? Well, for instance, obviously that would be a physician or a physician's assistant. Physician's assistants, you'll find those more in metropolitan areas, but nurse practitioners, many of you probably have a nurse practitioner that you deal with. Then there are chiropractors, physiotherapists, a dentist. Yes, if somebody knocks their tooth out at work or chips a tooth, that would be a WSIB claim, and it would go through. There are others too. WSIB keeps expanding their concept of who would be an approved medical care provider. For instance, years ago they were not allowing cannabis to be a treatment. They're now allowing cannabis under certain conditions to be used as a medical treatment. So all of you will have your incident or your accident or your injury package that you have available. Heavens, I really, really hope that none of you have any injured workers. But one of the best things you can do is prepare for that eventuality. And in there, you should probably put in a Form 8. Now, I know you're going to say, yeah, but the hospital has them or the urgent care has them. Just on the off chance something's not working that day, having that Form 8 available for them to be able to complete helps you to keep everything moving in the right direction. Then it can't be used as an excuse of, yeah, well, we couldn't fill it out. We didn't have it available. The Form 7, you could put that in there if you want, but in particular, the Form 6, that'll keep the injured worker entertained, potentially, depending upon the type of injury, while they're waiting to be seen by the medical care provider. If there's a particular safety data sheet that they use all the time, that might be worthwhile putting that in there. Our good old letters to the medical care provider. Hello, you're seeing our worker. We just need you to know that we have modified work available. And then the letter to the injured worker, reminding them, hey, we know that you're injured. We're sorry that you're injured, but we do have modified work. And there is WSIB requires that we all cooperate and work with each other on your recovery. Then we've got maybe the copy of your return to work policies, so that you could put those in as well. And then, of course, providing instructions, to the individual or to, if it's a supervisor that's going to manage it or a foreman, instructions for them as well. Pre-COVID, we could be there, we could be present and emerge or at urgent care. We could follow the process along. But when COVID arrived, they're not letting anybody else go in with the injured worker. So why is it you're going to care about your injured worker? Well, as you all know, the rate framework came in January the 1st, 2020. Many of you saw your premiums that you were paying in 2019 drop significantly, but that was a switch over to the new system. Then on top of that, there was also a further reduction that took place. But when questioned, WSIB will quite carefully and easily tell you, hey, you know what? We don't know how much it's going to actually cost you, because what they do is they take into account now 6 years worth of injury information, and they prorate each year at a certain percentage, which oddly enough, they're not overly willing to share. Anyway, so and unfortunately, if you do have any claims costs now, will be factored in. So I'm going to leave the question thing. I'm just going to zippity do along here just to keep on time, if that's okay with everybody. So let's talk about the injured worker, the impact on them, other people that work with them, and the employer. So are you aware of the fact that if they have a scheduled vacation, regardless of whatever the injury is, that they're actually allowed to take it? I know that may come as rather strange information to some of you, but if there's already a pre-scheduled vacation, they are allowed to take it, regardless of the fact that they're in the middle of physio. It's irrelevant. If it's already been scheduled, they can take it. Stat holidays can also be a big, big problem. For instance, let's think about perhaps the companies, it's not a stat holiday, but let's say the time between Christmas and New Year, and many companies will close down then. If you have an injured worker, and even if your company is completely closed down, that conversation needs to be had with the injured worker on whether or not they wish to engage in modified work or not. You should probably get that in writing as well. It's only happened a couple of times to me where the worker said, sure, yeah, I'll do it. Now, you might go, well, that's really, really strange because they've been injured and wouldn't they want time off? Yes, but you have to remember, if other people are being laid off for a whole week, they would have an opportunity to pick up work perhaps somewhere else. When you have an injured worker, they can't do that. When it comes to layoffs, they're pretty much untouchable. So they would again be one of the last entities that, or bodies of people that you would actually involve in a layoff. So what are some issues we have? Well, they might want to cooperate, but they might not want to. So one of the key parts of this is making sure that they understand what the process is before they get injured. There's no point, or there's little point of then trying to catch them up to, or bring them up to speed once they've had the injury, because then they're going to be on sensory overload. There are also other factors that are going to impact how that injured worker responds. Are they going to be cooperative or not? For some people, it'll be the first time they've ever had an injury in their lifetime. Maybe they've never felt pain before. Maybe they don't know what to do. And for some people, maybe they're scared. It's going to depend on, again, on the type of injury and the individual. Well, perhaps they've had a workplace injury before and they know how things work, or they think that they do. Or maybe Uncle Bob had an injury before, so they know exactly what's going to happen for them, or they think that they do. Our job is, as people in health and safety, is to educate them and let them know that WSIB changes its policies. So when Uncle Bob took 3 months off work for a sprained ankle, that's not necessary now. And WSIB will expect us as an employer, an employer's rep, to offer that injured worker work in the workplace while they recover. They might have a problem getting forms filled out. I have a particularly errant individual right now who absolutely refuses to get the FAFs filled out. Well, hang on, the employer's paying for it. And it's imperative as an employer, the employer's rep, that you understand how's this worker doing? If somebody's been doing the same, has the same modifications for 6 months or so, and they're not getting any better, and they're doing physio the whole time, there's a problem here. Maybe the worker just doesn't want to cooperate. And then getting hold of WSIB can be very, very challenging, especially since COVID-19, because everybody's working from home. I would suggest you phone the 1-800 number because they're the best ones to go with. There also can be issues with the spouse, a family member. What can you say to them? Absolutely nothing. So if they refuse you access to the injured worker, be sure to let WSIB know right away and say you've got to get on the phone to them. You don't really have a right to discuss what's going on with the injured worker with anybody but the injured worker. But certainly family members will try and maybe redirect what modified duties, or say, hey, you don't have to go to work tomorrow. They can't make you do that. Some of you have probably already heard that already. So there are a couple of key areas where employers lose control. The claim goes on for so long and you just can't see the wood for the trees. There's no resolution at all, and the employer gets frustrated. Or we don't assign somebody to manage that injured worker's recovery. So they kind of slide through the cracks, right? You forget that, oh, that's right, so-and-so's injured. Or you're reminded on the monthly cost statement, oh, that's right, so-and-so's still on modified duty, or so-and-so's still getting treatment. So again, it can be very, very frustrating because there's so many things that each and every one of you has to do that, having an injured worker just becomes another thing on top of everything else. But do make sure that you assign someone to have daily or weekly contact with that worker, and adjust those modified duties as the new medical information becomes available. Document everything. Communication is crucial to success, and it's great when you get the communication, but you've got to make sure you document it. Nothing overly major, just put some point forms down. The fact is, if the worker's doing well, and all of a sudden isn't, well, there's a problem somewhere. So do remember that both communication and documentation are absolutely crucial to this. There's only one injury that you can't really do anything about, and that would be a brain or a head injury. And again, make sure that if somebody bangs their head, that they get in for medical treatment immediately. And again, you can't offer modified work because anything you're going to offer for modified work is going to involve the engagement of the brain, and the brain needs to rest to recover. So we can prevent claims from going sideways. Get that injured worker to report to you. You should not have to go running around. Hey, where's Bob? Where's Bob? I'm sorry, I'm using the name Bob, but where's Bob? Where's Mohammed? Where are they? Remind the injured worker that they have a responsibility and they are accountable for their part in their recovery. It's not just all one-sided here. We need them to come forward and bring things to us. Oh my goodness, somebody doesn't show up for work. Please tell our supervisors and our foremen, if somebody doesn't show up for work, we need to know why. And we need to know why right away. Many of you have experienced it where you've heard the worker that, say, for instance, says 5 days later they show up to work. Somebody goes, well, where have you been? Well, I hurt myself at work. No, you didn't know. So our supervisors and our foremen are so key to us understanding that it's who's showing up to work and who hasn't. And we need to get that information right away. Worker cooperation. So now what? Yeah, we need the worker to cooperate. But the key part to this is make sure they all understand their responsibilities before an incident happens, because it's just going to be a lot easier that way. Well, I'm skipping past the questions. Now I'm going to talk to you about the Office of the Employer Advisor. It's paid for through your employer premiums. They give free confidential advice on the Workplace Safety Insurance Act and any reprisals under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Several different appeal levels. At the operations level, you can file an objection. You don't like a decision WSIB has made, you file an objection to it. You ask questions about it, you send them a letter. If nothing happens, now we're looking at the formal appeal for this. And then you would file that formal appeal with the Appeals Services Division. Once they get that, they're going to assign an appeals resolution officer to the case. Now, you'll end up going to an appeal. If you disagree with that decision, then you're off to the tribunal instead. That's the only other place to go to. When do you appeal? WCB changed this several years ago. You have time restraints under which you need to file an appeal. You have to pay attention. So it's 30 days if it's a decision that has to do with return to work, reemployment, or work transition decisions. You've got 6 months for other decisions. But if you miss that date, it's not a matter of, gee, I was like super busy and I kind of forgot. It's not about that. They've set those time limits in there, and I don't even know what excuse they would even accept. It's difficult to say, gee, I'm sorry, I kind of missed it. And then they go, oh, that's okay. Don't worry about it. So you do have to watch those letters, read those WSIB letters. So what is it that they're there for? Well, if you have fewer than 100 employees, they're there to give you help with the workers, with a worker appeal or with your own appeal. If you've got more than 100 people on payroll, then you know what? You call anyway, they'll give you the advice. So under Section 50 of the Act, they will represent in all unlawful reprisal matters. However, for this one, they'll only do the representation if you have fewer than 50 workers. And don't look for them to represent you for anything else under the Act. It just is under Section 50. So what do? Well, they're going to file forms for you. They'll review the disclosure documents. Those are the ones that come back that have the communication backwards and forwards between all the workplace parties, medical information. They will work with you to prepare for appeals. And for the love of God, make sure you show up to an appeal. It does not look good when there's no employer representative. Now, you may say to me, you know what, Al, that's why I've got the OEA. They're there to speak for me. There may be questions that come up through the appeals process where the OEA doesn't know the answer to it. It always looks better when the employer sends some level of representation in addition to the OEA. There's the phone number for this, the 1-800-387-0774. In closing, NCA also offers a facilitated Gold Seal course on injury management. And again, you can contact Karen or Natalie if you're interested. And then in addition to that, yes, I partnered with NCA. I actually run WSIB for now has allowed me to be a provider for their excellence, health and safety excellence program. So again, we'll be holding information sessions coming up. It is one of the ways to get money back from WSIB. Well, it's the only way now since they stopped the surcharges and the rebates. So are there any questions at all? Brian's coming up next. I'm so sorry. I'm a few minutes over. I apologize profusely for that. Or if we're going straight over to Brian, then if you wanted to send any questions to Karen or to Natalie, then they can pass them over and I can reply. So thank you guys so much for putting up with me. I really appreciate it. Hope you got a bit of information from the presentation. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ella. Does anybody have any specific questions for Ella at this time? Again, if you could open up the chat window and type them in if you do. And if there isn't any questions, we're going to take a 5-minute break and come back at 1:45 for Brian's presentation. So let me know if there's any questions. And again, if we don't get them right away, we will make sure that we'll get them after the event. Okay, so we'll see you all back in about 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm going to ask Jack McKernan to unmute and introduce our next speaker.
Okay, okay, good. I'm open. Thank you very much. Well, it certainly is my pleasure, folks, to introduce Brian Barron here today. He's a senior manager for the Construction Health and Safety Program at the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development. Brian has been with the ministry since 2004, has held various positions, including Occupational Health and Safety Inspector. Prior to joining the ministry, he worked in construction for most of the subsections, including ICI, residential, and heavy civil. I give you Brian Barron. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks very much. And thanks for having me, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to bring my presentation up here. Oh, sorry. Not the things. Okay. Where is it? It was up on here. Just give me one quick second here. I've got, all right, 1 second here, folks. Sorry about that. I had it up and then it closed here on me. So I do want to thank everybody for their time today. Apparently, I sort of pulled the short straw here in terms of topics. There's not too many people out here who are really receptive to this particular topic itself. It's a tricky one for sure, but definitely important to try and sort of understand kind of how this works and really what you know, kind of why we prosecute. So I've got it here. Okay. So can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so the topic that was really sort of assigned is, you know, what goes into a prosecution? Like, why does the MLTSD prosecute? And there's a few different reasons. So generally speaking, when we prosecute, it's usually for one of two sort of significant reasons. And the first one would be non-compliance with the act or the regulation. So you haven't complied with sections. Generally speaking, it's a repeat non-contravention, or it's a contravention that would be considered a killer contravention. So something that's known to cause significant injury or fatality. And then the second is the actual event of a injury, a fatality, a building collapse, that sort of thing. So we've been called in from a reactive sort of perspective. Now, when we take a look at sort of the two reasons, because there's a lot of questions that come up, and almost always when a company gets prosecuted, it's, well, why me? Like, why am I getting, why do I have to go to court and that sort of thing? And there's really kind of two reasons. The first being sort of specific deterrence. And when I talk about specific deterrence, it's, you know, if say I'm the employer, I have somebody who's fallen off of a roof, it's to penalize me for not doing something. So probably not having that worker wear fall protection, potentially not training them, whatever the story is, whatever the contributing factors were to that particular incident. So it would be some level of penalty that's levied against me to basically say, hey, don't do that again. You've done something wrong, don't do it again. But one of the other reasons, and one of the really important reasons, is general deterrence. So that general deterrence really sort of applies to all other companies that are out there. So any other company that does work similar to what I was, say, doing, it's really kind of a warning to them saying, hey, listen, this guy does this type of work. He had this type of an incident. If you engage in that type of activity, you too could be liable for this. You know, and you could get a fine or even potentially jail time. So there's really kind of those two reasons. So it's the specific, so that's specific to the company, and then general, which is more to the industry to kind of let them know. And we'll get into sort of public interest a little bit in a second here, but it really kind of leans towards that a little bit. Now, considerations for our prosecutions. So first off, there's got to be the realistic prospect of conviction. So if we take a look at a company who has done absolutely everything reasonable under the circumstances, it was truly sort of an unforeseen situation. It was something where the worker had been given all the training, given all the equipment, that sort of stuff, but they simply made an error. So potentially an error in judgment, they forgot to actually clip off, but everything was in place. All other workers were tied off, that sort of stuff. The realistic prospect of conviction is probably reasonably low in that particular situation, because really, what are you trying to sort of achieve by prosecuting a company that has done everything reasonable in the circumstances? And the courts are going to look at that and say, well, no, like there's nothing else they could have done. It's unreasonable to actually take them to court over that. So there's got to be that piece. So we're going to turn around. So when we actually prepare a prosecution brief, it actually goes through multiple levels of review to make sure that really there's that reasonable prospect of conviction. But then secondly, that it's in the public interest. And when we talk about the public interest, it's really looking at, the public wants to see sort of some of these incidents corrected and that sort of thing. But if there's nothing really to be corrected, nothing more really could have been done, it's not in the public interest to go down that path. And quite frankly, it's probably a waste of the court's time. And there are cases that are like that. So there are plenty of cases that we go in and we do an investigation and we kind of look at it and say, like, this is something where, I don't want to call it a freak accident or anything like that. But there is something out there where it is human error. So we look at it and we say, something, they did have everything in place. This really isn't in the public interest to kind of go forward with it. And we will choose not to go forward with a prosecution on it. Now, the next one is the seriousness of the offense. So we have a couple different types of prosecutions that we can initiate. I'll go into them a little bit more in detail as we kind of go on. But the seriousness of the offense really kind of plays heavily into this. So if you take a look at something like a fatality or a critical injury, those are serious. That's pretty big stuff. Somebody's lost their life, or they've had some sort of a life-altering sort of experience as a result of an injury out there. And that's something that we can't just kind of, turn away and say, well, they were pretty close. They were, they were on their way to sort of compliance and that sort of stuff. It's something where, the most serious of serious things have happened here, and we really do have to prosecute. And in those situations, our hands are, I wouldn't say they're tied, but they're kind of getting there. So when we look at just kind of the, just how heavy a burden there is behind that sort of an incident, then we have to factor that in. And then the last one is the steps taken by the defendant to avoid the offense. So Mr. Langlois earlier was talking about sort of all the different training that's out there and taking your training seriously and making sure that your workers understand that training and that sort of stuff. If you're a good employer who's going through all of those steps to really evaluate whether your worker is qualified to undertake the work that you've really hired them to do, and perhaps you've even gone to the extent of saying, listen, this person's just not cut out for this job, something's going to happen. Those are all things that when we talk about things like documentation and everything else, all of that goes towards sort of that concept of due diligence. So you as an employer or as a supervisor is really, undertaking their job very seriously. They're putting a lot of time and effort into the adequate level of sort of supervision of workers and that sort of thing. And those are all really important steps taken by whoever, whether it's the employer, the constructor, the supervisor, or even the worker, the steps that they've actually taken to avoid the actual offense, right? So like when you look at it and we get down to they've taken all precautions reasonable in the circumstances, that's really what we're looking at here. Is we're saying, listen, they did everything they needed to do, or they should have done, or could have really sort of foreseen doing in the circumstance. And if that's the case, there's no realistic prospect of conviction. There's no public interest in going after a company like that. And I know a lot of companies, they get really worried about that sort of the 25-2H. So we hear a lot about that. And that's, an employer's duty to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances. And, a lot of companies will look at that and say, well, it's everything possible. I have to do everything possible. Well, it's not really possible to do that because you can't really foresee a lot of different things happening. It's everything probable. So, one of the big examples that I use when I talk about sort of section 25(2)(h) is, is it possible for a plane to crash into your site? It is, for sure it is. It would be a horrendous event and everything else, but it's certainly possible for that to happen. Is it probable? No, it is not. So we would not turn around and expect you to try and protect against something like that. That's absolutely unreasonable. So, but when we take a look at something along the lines of, like, let's say you're working close to an active roadway, is there a chance that somebody could go off the road and crash into your site? There is, and it's actually probable to some degree. So depending on how close you are to the roadway and that sort of stuff, it does happen and it's likely. So would it be reasonable to say that you've got to have potentially barriers up? And let's say it's not really directly on the roadway, but right beside it, sort of thing. We may turn around and say, listen, you really do need to try and protect your workers against this, despite the fact that maybe some of the traffic protection sections wouldn't apply in that case, because there is a high likelihood that something would actually occur. So when we take a look at that, it's looking at the probability of something happening and protecting your workers against it. So those are kind of four of the main considerations that we have when we, consider prosecution for whether it's non-compliance or in relation to some sort of a reactive event. Now, when we look at sort of the compliance continuum, and I'm sure you've seen this diagram for a million other things, but you kind of take a look at this pyramid, right? And I think we can all agree that sort of the weightiest and probably the foundation of all of this is kind of the bottom. It's the biggest portion of the of the pyramid, and this is what we consider the compliance continuum. So when we look at that, the most powerful tool that you've really got is sort of that education, outreach, and awareness. So you want the highest trained workforce out there with the right level of resources, the right level of equipment, and that type of stuff. And they've got to have that right level of knowledge to be able to actually undertake the job that they've been hired to perform. That's where we want people to be. And that's not where the Ministry of Labor Training and Skills Development is really focused. We're not looking at sort of, there's really kind of three categories of companies. There's the watch me companies, which they're the high performers. They're the ones who exceed the regulations in the act. So they're the ones who say, hey, look at this. We came up with a new process that goes above and beyond the act or the regulations. Then what we've got is we've got the middle group, and the middle group is the show me group. That show me group is, they're trying, but they're maybe missing a couple components. They don't really have it fully refined yet, but we can see that they're really making significant efforts. And again, that's not really where our inspectors are best spent. That's where a consultant is really, really well kind of placed there, is to kind of help guide them in the right direction, get them to that finish line of a really good health and safety management program. But then where we're really interested and that sort of show me is, the compliance commitment area type thing, maybe a bit into that enforcement chunk, right? So that's that middle group. But then we've got the make me company. So it's the companies who willfully, disobey law, and it could be any level of law kind of thing. But from our perspective, really kind of the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulations, they're the ones who turn around and say, listen, this is all a cost of doing business. And those are really the most dangerous employers. They're the ones who turn around, their risk tolerance goes way beyond what an acceptable level would be. They're the ones where they're not wearing fall protection. They don't have traffic control persons on a site when equipment's backing up, that type of thing. And that's where our time is really spent. And that's where we really kind of want to focus that prosecution end of it. So that's your last ditch effort. That's not where we want companies to be. And in all honesty, I mean, any company that's really kind of signing up for an event like this to learn a little bit more, chances are that's not where you are. You're probably down in the show me and hopefully even to that watch me category. So that, like into that sort of green zone of this diagram. And those are, so we don't really want to prosecute those groups that are doing a good job. They're making those efforts and that sort of stuff. That's not where our focus is. Now, do we come across those? Yes. So we will come on to job sites. A lot of you are saying, well, why are you visiting my job site if I'm really good? You're never issuing me orders. We don't always know who's on that job site. So when we go out there, we might just know that a constructor is working there, but we don't know who those employers are that are on the job site. And hopefully all of your health and safety systems and your policies and procedures transfer over to all of the employers that are on the site, and they're sort of doing what they're supposed to be doing on the project. But when we go out and take a look at a job site, we're not going out looking for people to prosecute. That's really not the goal. The goal is just to monitor compliance with the act and the regulations, and we really hope you guys are in that green area. We don't really want to go into that enforcement prosecution area. It's not a great scenario for anybody there. So that's kind of how we base our compliance continuum. Is we really want people in that highly educated area at the bottom where they're just doing what they ought to be doing anyway. Now, when we look at prosecution, there's two parts under the Provincial Offences Act that we deal with the Ministry of Labor Training and Skills Development. So there's part one, and part one is kind of the lesser of the two types of prosecution. Part one is kind of certificate of offense. If any of you guys have ever seen it, it's very similar to a traffic ticket. All of it really comes out of the same spot, and it uses a schedule of offenses. So it's basically prescribed sections. So if you're not wearing fall protection, we issue a charge for that, and it's a set fine, and that's really all there is to it for an offense notice. Now, there's also a summons that's under that. They're not used as often, but there's summonses which you could be liable for a fine up to $1,000, but you have to go and appear in court. And it looks very similar to the offense notice, so to the actual ticket, but you're going to be given a court date. You're going to go, and you've got the option to plead guilty, or you've got the option to really sort of challenge the summons, and you would go to trial at that point. So those are two of probably the more common prosecutions that we undertake. So it's usually just kind of a mild corrective action. So you're going to get an order and a ticket. Excuse me. I have to apologize. I'm actually just getting over COVID, so it takes a bigger toll on the lungs than I actually would have thought. But now going into the second part of this, so it's part three of the Provincial Offences Act, and these are the big charges. These are the ones that everybody sort of hears about. It's in really kind of every presentation, and they talk about fines of up to $1.5 million per offense and up to a year in jail and that sort of stuff. And that's where part three comes in. So those don't have a schedule of offenses. Those particular prosecutions can be dealt with under any section of the regulation or the act out there, and they carry some significant fines. Now, similar to part one, part three has two different forms. There's a long form and a short form. So the short form is called a 104, and it looks very similar to a certificate of offense. So it looks very similar to that, almost like traffic ticket. It carries the same weight in terms of the actual fines that it could carry. So it's up to $500,000 for a supervisor or worker. It's up to $1.5 million for a director or officer of the company, and then up to $1.5 million for the corporation as well. Or there's a long form. So what would end up happening is, generally speaking, we would do, and both of them require an investigation, but the investigation would take place. So let's say it's an injury, we would investigate, and then we have up to 2 years to actually lay that charge with the courts. So we could come to you 2 years later and say, by the way, that incident that you had, year and a half, 2 years ago, here's your summons to appear in court, and then you would have to appear. So those are the two types that we do. The rest of these, the rest of the parts under the POA actually deal with very different areas, and it's something we don't get involved with a whole lot. Now, when we look at the actual commencement of either one of these types of prosecutions, so part one, generally speaking, is used for minor offenses. So it's potentially the first time that you've been caught not wearing fall protection or not having a trench box in place or anything like that. The limitation period, so we have to charge you within 30 days. So we've got up to 30 days to actually go and give you that part one, either offense notice or summons. And then the offense varies based on the schedule. And I'll show you a little bit of that a little bit later on. But it'll change sort of in value in terms of how much the actual ticket is. And then the summons, which I've already talked about, is up to $1,000 per offense. Now, these matters, when you actually go to court, they're heard before. Usually it's a justice of the peace. Occasionally it's a judge, but you would go to your first appearance, where then they would make another appointment if you want to fight it, to go back and actually have your trial. Now, part 3, so both of these are used to initiate prosecutions, but part 3 is usually for a more significant offense. So for a major injury, a fatality, repeat contravention. So if we keep catching you doing the same thing, so every time we show up, you don't have guardrails in place, or you're not tied off, it would be inappropriate to continue to issue a part 1 offense notice or a summons to you, because clearly you haven't learned your lesson at that point. So now we're going to step it up. We're going to go for that part 3. Now, the limitation period, which I already talked about, is 2 years less a day. Now, that comes in July 1st. Right now, the limitation period is 1 year. We just increased it to 2 years, plus increased the fine amounts to actually be more consistent with other jurisdictions within Canada. We were actually lagging behind a fair bit in terms of what was required. Now, a lot of people say, well, why do you guys get 2 years to investigate? Generally speaking, it doesn't take us that long. When we actually do our investigation, most investigations wrap up usually within about a 10-week period. The 2 years deals with highly technical investigations. So the tower cranes that came down in 2020 in Toronto, that would be an example of where we would really need kind of, probably up to the 2 years to actually do the forensic analysis as to why the crane came down, or a building collapse. If you look at the Elliott Lake Mall, I think it was Algo Center Mall in Elliott Lake that came down. Those are complex investigations. They're not something that it's just a matter of saying, hey, I witnessed this person 3 times over the past 2 years not wearing fall protection. These are things where you have to bring in a ton of experts, use labs and that sort of stuff to really determine the failure, to find out whether an offense was truly committed. So that's why the 2 years, it was increased from 1 year to 2 years. Now, the penalties went from $100,000 to $500,000 for a person or a supervisor. Okay, so that's for a worker or a supervisor. When we say up to $500,000, that's something that doesn't happen very often or at all. We almost never get the maximum penalty. It would have to be the absolute worst of the worst of the worst investigations for that to happen. And how all of this is determined is really based on previous cases and case law. So they take a look at it and they will factor in multiple different things when we look at what that fine is going to be. And it's not us who actually determines it. So the Crown or the defense, upon a guilty conviction sort of thing, whether it's a plea or a conviction, will suggest what they think is the appropriate fine level. And it's based on previous cases, but it's ultimately the judge or the justice of the peace that actually determines that amount. So they're going to be the ones who turn around and say that's either a reasonable number or it's unreasonable and we think it should be less or more, depending on the situation. But everything will go into that decision, everything from the size of the company to the severity of the offense to what's happened in the past. So it's not like all of a sudden it's, hey, it's your first non-compliance type thing. You're going to get $500,000 and a year in jail just because of that. Well, that's not how that works. It actually goes back and looks at all of the different cases that have happened to find out what that reasonable number is. Now it's the same, excuse me, it's the same for a director or officer of the company, except for it's been increased to $1.5 million per offense. So we're getting into big bucks with all of these under part 3. So these are things that you really need to take very seriously. So when you're looking at sort of what you're doing out there for your company, whatever level of compliance and that sort of stuff that you're trying to achieve, you really kind of want to make sure that you get it right. These are numbers that really no company wants to deal with. But again, these are maximums per offense. So very rarely would you ever see a number go this high. This is really to deal with those corporations, those officers of the companies and stuff like that, that are the ones where it's kind of like, well, it's a cost of doing business. And believe it or not, there are a lot of companies that are out there that picture things this way, where it's basically, hey, injuries and fatalities are just part of the game. And they're not. They have no business in a workplace. And I think all of us know that and can agree upon it. Now, a corporation is the same. So it's up to $1.5 million per offense. And the exact same with everything else. It's all based on the previous cases that we're looking at. Now, mind you, you will see those fine amounts climb pretty quickly if you've had, a couple Part 3 prosecutions against you. The courts are going to have very little tolerance for that. So when you start looking at those numbers really starting to climb, for a company who's just routinely non-compliant, you're going to climb up that scale pretty darn quick. And it becomes really difficult to defend, why it is you've been caught not complying or injuring workers over and over and over again. Now, in this case here, you can be heard in front of a justice of the peace. In a lot of the bigger cases, they'll elect to go before a judge. But bottom line is that it can be either in that one as well. Now, I've talked a little bit about how sort of the fines are determined. So Part 1 offense notices, they're already scheduled. We don't have the ability to change an offense notice. It's whatever the schedule says, and you can actually see all of the schedules in the back of the green book. It'll list them all out. There's actually a fair number of set fines that are in there. We can't change any of those. The only time that can be changed is if you were to challenge it in court. You were still found to be guilty, but you had perhaps an extenuating circumstance that the Justice of the Peace decided to lower it for. But the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development has no ability to change that amount. A summons, again, is determined by the Justice of the Peace, and it's up to $1,000 per offense. So you will receive, and it's only the offenses that are actually presented on each individual summons, and there can only be one offense per summons. And then Part 3 prosecution, again, that is based on sort of previous case law, as well as your record as well. Now, where does our authority come from? So there's a couple spots that it comes from. Under Section 54 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, that gives us the authority to enter upon any workplace without notice and inspect and ensure compliance on that actual site. Now, in terms of the Provincial Offences Act, it's really what sort of sets the process, and it sets all the different parts for prosecution, and really is what gives us the ability to charge somebody. It's the same thing as what a police officer has, or a Ministry of Environment officer, or a Ministry of Natural Resources officer as well. So it all falls under the same thing. So all of us are designated as provincial offences officers. Now, it applies to all provincial legislation. And it basically, so what it does is it basically sets out, so this is where some people get confused. They think that there's a 6-month statute of limitations, but it's only where one isn't already provided. So for us, it's 30 days for Part 1 and up to 2 years as of July 1st for Part 3. So it's a little bit different. So it can be a little bit confusing if you're looking at things independently. Now, excuse me. This is a separate system. So the Provincial Offences Act is separate from the criminal court. Now, we do have, so there's the Westray Bill, or Bill C-45 that came in 2004, which allowed for criminal proceedings to take place for things that are under the Occupational Health and Safety Act or the construction regulations. It has rarely been used to sort of prove that a Provincial Offences Act or something was a provincial offense. It's really not, you just have to really be able to prove that you've contravened something. Proving that you have committed a crime is something very different. And it's something that, generally speaking, as long as you didn't have sort of the intent to hurt somebody or something along those lines, it's going to be very difficult to go down that path. It's a really high standard to hit, but they are different. So you do need to be aware of that. If it went over to sort of the Bill C-45, that criminal investigation side of things, the process changes significantly. And I'm not really going to go into that because that's something that's kind of really outside of what we normally do. And then really kind of the last part of this is it's under the Provincial Offences Act. We are all provincial offences officers at the Ministry of Labour Training and Skills Development, the field staff are. And there's a whole bunch of different sort of appointments that are in here. Ours comes under subsection 3, which basically gives the ministry or the Crown the ability to designate in writing any person or class of persons as a provincial offences officer. And that's how our inspectors are actually classified. So all of them basically carry a badge. All of them have the ability to issue Part 1 and Part 3 prosecutions. And it all comes under the Provincial Offences Act under that subsection. Now, I just want to quickly go over sort of the different schedules that we have. So this is for Part 1. So under Part 1, there's really sort of, there's 3 or 4 schedules that really kind of impact the construction industry. So one of them is under the Occupational and Safety Act. So a failure to fulfill your duties under the Act. There's actually 17 different set fines that are in there. And again, you can find it actually in the back of your Occupational and Safety Act and construction regulations. It's right at the back. It'll list them all out. But then specifically under the construction regulation, under Schedule 67, there's 102 different scheduled offenses that are in there. So that's the stuff that talks about failure to wear fall protection, failure to use sort of stilts correctly and that sort of thing. And it will actually list out sort of all the wording for it. And then it's continued in Schedule 67.1, and there's an additional 53 scheduled offenses within that as well. So it's pretty significant, the number of offenses that we can issue. Now, under Part 3, though, it's virtually any section under the Occupational and Safety Act and the construction regulations, or really any regulation that applies on the site. We can issue a charge under any of those different sections. And again, that comes under usually sort of a long form. So we're going to say you did commit the offense of whatever the story is, and the burden of proof is on us. We have to prove that you've done that. So you've got to meet sort of all the elements of the offense and that sort of thing. This is just sort of an example of what you would actually see. So if you look at the chart sort of down below, so worker failing to work in compliance was 26.12. So that's the fall protection section. By not being adequately protected by fall protection, they would be liable for a fine of $350. And that's under Part 1. Under Part 3, depends on a lot of different factors as to what you're going to get charged for that. And then finally, the victim fine surcharge. So the amount that you actually get charged in both Part 1 and Part 3 isn't the amount you actually get charged. So if you, let's say you're found guilty and you're given a fine of $10,000, there's actually another 25% that goes on top of that. So it would actually be $12,500 that you have to pay. That $2,500 of that 25% goes to victims of crime. So it goes into an account where it's distributed to victims of crime. And then there's usually a court fee that's on top of that as well. So these are pretty significant charges. So when you take a look at this, it's really, you know, like when you're listening to sort of, you know, Mr. Langlois and Elaine, you know, they're really trying to kind of help you avoid this stuff. That's really kind of the key to this entire thing. And that's kind of really all that I wanted to talk to you guys about today. I imagine you're going to have some questions for me, and I'm more than happy to answer them if I can. I'll just let you know right away. If you're going to ask me sort of about an active investigation, I can't talk about those sorts of things. But if you do have questions about how this stuff works, I'm more than happy to talk to you about it.
Thanks so much, Brian. Again, if anyone wants to type in their questions in the chat box, that would be greatly appreciated. We'll give it a couple minutes to see if anything comes in.
So I do see one thing here from Graham Scott. So just wondering when the new regulation basically will be updated and printed. It's actually updated, and I believe it's actually in print through the Queen's printing press. But if you go online, you can actually, so the e-laws is updated regularly with all of the changes. So it will capture everything new within it. whether it's the act or the construction regulations.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, we'll give it a couple minutes. Oh, we have something here.
So how does the coroner's inquest tie into the prosecution process? So they're actually separate and apart. So the coroner's inquest is sort of a quasi-legal proceeding. It's not something that's designed to assign fault or blame to anybody. The entire purpose of the coroner's inquest is to look for gaps in the regulation or some way to potentially sort of improve the health and safety system so that that particular incident doesn't occur again. Now it seems similar. So if you've ever attended a coroner's inquest, it operates very much like a trial, but generally speaking, the actual prosecution process, the part where you're found guilty or not guilty, usually happens first, and then it's followed up by the coroner's inquest. And the reason that's done is just due process. So it's basically looking at, you dispose of sort of the fines, the penalties, that sort of stuff. You deal with sort of that specific and general deterrence and the things. Then you move into what can we do to ensure that, this never happens again. So can we change regulations? Can we put out new hazard alerts and that type of thing? So that's usually how that sort of thing works. More often than not, the recommendations that we get. So how the process works is there's a jury in a coroner's inquest, and that jury will listen to all the evidence presented to them, and then they will make a determination as to what they think should be recommended in terms of changes. I can tell you that probably 95% of the time, the recommendations that are given to us as a result of a coroner's inquest result in virtually no changes. So there are things where either they've misheard evidence that's been brought up, or it's something where they've asked for something that's really outside of the scope of sort of whether it's regulatory change or change to the act and that sort of thing. Generally speaking, the regulations that are in place cover virtually everything that we need to deal with. Now, you could argue that there's opportunities to streamline it a bit, make it a little easier to understand and that sort of stuff. And there's certainly an argument for that. But in the end of it, if you follow the regulations, if you follow the act, generally speaking, you're not going to have injuries and fatalities and that sort of stuff. Now, the biggest hurdle that we have is health and safety culture on a site. We still in construction deal very much with sort of that macho mentality where it's never going to happen to me, and that type of thing. And that's the biggest thing that we struggle with, is there's not that strong health and safety culture. I mean, the fact is every time you put up a new wall on a construction project, you hit the reset button in terms of health and safety. It's everything changes again. So you've taken down your guardrails, you put a wall up, now you got to put new guardrails up in that window. And that example can be used for a new floor being put on. It can be used for virtually every part of construction. The fact is it changes second by second. It's an ever evolving or workplace. And that's where it becomes really difficult. Workers become complacent very, very quickly. And then they also make judgment errors. They make mistakes. Everybody does, every one of us, kind of thing. So when we look at those recommendations made by a coroner's jury, it's very rarely do they result in significant change. Now they do in some cases in a low percentage kind of thing, but it's a very different process, and it can be kind of difficult. Okay, Michael Langlois, can you be charged under section 217.1 under the criminal code and also charged under part 3 of the Provincial Offences Act? You know what, it's actually something that I have to look into, because I don't know that you can. One of them is a provincial offense, but the other one is a criminal charge. So it's something that I would actually have to follow up on and get back to you. It's happened so rarely. There's been very few cases. I think there's only actually been a couple where we've successfully gone down this path. So it's something that I actually have to get back to you on. I would tend to think probably not, but I really have to check on it. if you guys want, feel free to hit me with questions. I think we're pretty early here, which I'm hoping doesn't screw you guys up too bad.
Nope.
I sort of expected to be attacked a little bit when talking about prosecutions. You always feel like there's a great big target on you. Okay, so can you talk about how completing safety paperwork, inspections, hazard assessments can help you if charges are brought? So very simply, it proves, it's one of the few things that can actually prove that you're doing what you should be doing as an employer or supervisor. So when you go through and you're doing your inspections, you know, by actually sort of going through and truthfully, and this is where, this is really the key, because more often than not, what will end up happening is we know people know how to play the game. You know, they treat this as a game, and it really isn't. So when you go through and you're taking sort of, whether it's IHSA's sort of standard checklist, it could be on a crane or something like that, and we look at it and it's checked off perfect every day for the entire, you know, length of the log kind of thing, we're probably going to call BS to some degree. I mean, the fact is things break, things stop working. We know that. Every one of us owns a car where it ticks you right off when one of the lights comes on, or you get a flat tire, or there's something going on. Those sorts of things we know happen. That's not a problem. By inspecting it and actually finding what the issue was and addressing it. So first off, catching it on your inspection report, but then actually going and doing something with it. So potentially bringing in a mechanic, bringing in somebody of, you know, expert knowledge kind of thing to actually go through and resolve the issue. That's exactly how this is supposed to work. You're not going to get in trouble for that. We're not going to turn around and say, oh, geez, you know, you got this piece of equipment that something broke on. We know that's going to happen. Having that piece of paperwork there showing that, number one, you identified that there was an issue, but number two, you corrected that issue, goes a really long way to showing that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing as an employer, supervisor, or worker. You're fulfilling really those obligations. Now, hazard assessments are an amazing tool. So the hazard assessments are things where it's really trying to sort of identify, okay, we're doing this job. What do we need for this? It's not a matter of just looking at sort of the material that you have available to you. It's looking at the equipment that you need and the appropriate level of equipment that you need. And by turning around and saying, hey, we did a hazard assessment, we recognized that the worker needed this level of respirator, they needed this level of eye protection or gloves and that sort of stuff. And we see that they were actually provided with that. We see that they were wearing it up to some extent kind of thing. And then perhaps they chose to take it off, or maybe their glasses fogged up and that's when something went in their eye, something along those lines. At the very least, as an employer or supervisor, you can come back to us and say, geez, you know, okay, we recognize that maybe the right or the wrong glasses were selected because we didn't identify maybe the fogging up issue, but we really tried. That's a very different discussion than, well, the workers know what to do, or the worker should have known that kind of thing. There's two different levels of discussion that happens there. So some of the examples that I usually use are things like the power line industry. So where you've got people working with high voltage and that sort of thing. They're in an industry that is so highly self-regulated that they turn around and they do toolbox talks basically daily. They live and breathe health and safety. That's sort of the absolute number one priority over sort of the production piece. And it's because the stakes are so high. But they go through and they do a fabulous job of hazard assessments, risk assessments, whatever you want to call it, but they will go through every task on that job. And if they come across something that they didn't encounter or they didn't expect, they stop. They stop and they reassess at that point. And when you can show that level of supervision and that level of responsibility, it's highly unlikely that the prospect of conviction is going to be there. It's highly unlikely that it's in the public interest to go after a company like that, because they've gone through all of the paperwork. They've gone through the exercise of really trying to sort of identify what they should have been doing. Now, it's not to say that they couldn't be charged. They could be, but it will significantly impact the penalty that's associated with them. So there may still be public interest with some of it. There may still be a reasonable prospect of conviction. And we've done that in the past. But what will end up happening is during the trial, all of that information will come out and say, hey, here's a company that's in that sort of show me category where, yeah, they weren't 100% there, but they were on their way. They were making efforts, and that should be taken into account, when trying to determine what the appropriate level of penalty is for them. So it absolutely does help when done correctly. When it's just done as sort of an exercise to appease the Ministry of Labor, it has no effect at all. I mean, if you're just going through and just checking everything off just to say, hey, we did that, it's pointless. Don't do it for us. You need to do it for you, and you need to do it to actually really try to identify sort of the areas where you think you might get caught up, kind of thing. Has an injured worker ever been charged or prosecuted? That's a good question. I don't actually know. So a lot of the time, what will end up happening is where the worker is at fault, and they've been injured. We will turn around and say, listen, you're kind of an author of your own misfortune. And let's just assume, let's keep it clean here. Like, let's say that the employer and supervisor did absolutely everything they needed to do. So they're not even the subject of any level of prosecution. We're not even looking at them. It's purely just the worker has done something themselves. More often than not, we turn around and we will say that it's, really, what more are you really trying to sort of prove with that worker by giving them a fine? They've already been injured. Now it's going to depend on possibly the level of injury and that sort of thing. But more often than not, there's already been sort of an inherent penalty in it. But I don't want to say that we wouldn't do that. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head if we have or not. I imagine we probably have, but I can't say that with certainty.
Thanks, Brian. Does anyone have any further questions? Okay, at this point, we're going to take about a 5-minute break and return about 2:37 for Lisa. So we'll see you in about 5 minutes.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, returning. Everybody can hear me okay? At this point, I'd like to welcome and introduce NCA President Michael Marinac to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Karen. As the president of the NCA, it's a particular privilege to introduce to everyone Lisa Bolton of Sherrard and Coos law firm in Toronto. Lisa is a highly accomplished litigator with significant experience acting in a wide range of public and private sector clients. She's a former general counsel of a public multinational company, and Lisa's understanding and appreciation of both the client and litigator's perspective enables her to help clients manage risk by providing effective business solutions and using litigation where beneficial to advance business goals. Among her other accomplishments, Lisa is recognized as a leading lawyer in occupational health and safety, a 5-star Safety Lawyer Award from the Canadian Occupational Safety. And Lisa is also a frequent speaker at national and local conferences and is widely published on a variety of matters relating to employment and labor law. Lisa's expertise covers a vast area of topics as she's involved in many associations. And with that, welcome, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Michael.
My pleasure.
I'm going to start with the presentation. So hopefully I can get it shared with everyone quickly here. There we go. So we're going to talk about prosecution and due diligence. There definitely will be a little bit of overlap in areas, particularly with Brian's presentation right before me. So I'll try to keep those parts to a minimum, although I think I probably have a little bit of a different perspective on some of it. But when it comes to the upcoming amendments, I'll just try to breeze through those because Brian's already covered them. So here's just a quick agenda. I'm going to talk about prosecution, charges and penalties, the disclosure process, defenses and guilty pleas, some of the things that you need to take into consideration. And if it goes to the stage of trial, talking about trial and sentencing. And then I'll also talk about due diligence from a defense standpoint. Michael earlier talked a little bit about that. So I think the things that I'll be saying will dovetail nicely with what you've already heard. So let's just dive right in and talk about the prosecution section first. So generally circumstances that I've experienced that can lead to a charge under the OHSA and in acting for clients and helping them defend against charges. There are a couple of ones. I mean, obviously the most frequent one is a violation that's discovered during an accident investigation. Typically that's resulting from a critical injury, a fatality, for example, or another serious injury. But also failure to comply with an order. Brian mentioned, you know, if there are repeat instances of violations, so it could start with getting that ticket initially or a Part 1 summons, and then if the employer does not fix the problem or it continues to be a problem, then there could be a prosecution that results from that. Also, sometimes we see charges relating to failure to comply with some other requirement under the Occupational Health and Safety Act or the regulations. So for example, it could be a failure to comply with the accident reporting requirements after a critical injury, for instance. So if you don't get your Section 51 report in on time, there could very well be a charge. In the cases that I've seen it, it's been sort of what I consider an add-on charge in addition to other charges. But it's certainly something, it's a violation, and so there's typically a charge that would flow from that. And I would also just point out, and Brian did mention it, that the Crown has to prove that there has to be a reasonable prospect of conviction when the Crown is laying a charge and deciding whether to lay a charge, so that there is that level of scrutiny that is supposed to be there for for the Crown in deciding whether or not to proceed with charges. Limitation periods, Brian covered that as well. The part 1 is that 30 days, and part 3, it's always been 1 year, but that's changing. So as of July 1, it's going to be 2 years for the Crown to lay a charge. Certainly what I've experienced recently, and particularly during the pandemic, I don't know whether it's necessarily staffing issues or access issues, but things have been down to the wire when it comes to that 1 year limitation period. So so the information may be sworn 3 days before the end of the limitation period, whereas in the past, certainly it's been more like last minute would be considered to be 3 weeks, and now it's often within days of the deadline when the information is actually sworn. So Brian indicated the intention was to give more time for those significant incidences, and I guess it will sort of be borne out in the future as to whether whether the general timeline is going to change as to when we might see charges following a critical accident, for example. But there will be 2 years as of July 1st. Common charges from a construction standpoint, typically it's failure to comply with a specific requirement in a regulation. So we often see charges that are tied to a violation under Regulation 213-91. Other really common ones are lack of instruction and training by the employer or by the supervisor, for example, and the catch-all, really failure to take all reasonable precautions for the safety of a worker. So those are typically the charges that we see, going from the specific to the more general type of charge. And I've noticed some trends. I've certainly been doing this for well, more than a decade. And what I tend to see now, which I saw much less of in the past, are multiple charges arising out of the same factual circumstances. So, maybe 5-10 years ago, I would look at a summons and, there would be 1, 2, maybe 3 charges against the employer. And I would say now it's more like 3, 4, 5, 6 or more charges against the employer. And it's not necessarily that the complexity of the incident has necessarily changed. I think it's just a different mindset. So we're seeing more charges arising out of the same accident. Also, another trend is, charges against multiple workplace parties. So it's not just the employer company anymore. We're seeing more charges directly against supervisors and also directors and officers. And particularly that one, I'm seeing more charges right now. And certainly I think given the amendment that moves the penalty for a conviction for directors and officers and lines it up with the monetary penalty for the corporation. So I think we can expect that we will see charges against directors and officers more frequently being laid. Penalties, this has more or less been covered. So part one, those set fine amounts, you can look in your green book and there are pages and pages of what the set fines are. They're different for workers versus supervisors. So, the amounts will vary. Part three, we just laid it out there as a reminder again. And don't forget about the victim fine surcharge. So that's really an additional amount that goes on top of whatever the fine is. And so, if you're making a decision about a guilty plea, for example, or trying to look at, what the actual economic outcome may be, you need to add on that additional 25%. Now, I also want to talk about alternatives to charges. So an inspector can also issue an order for an employer to comply with the act or the regulations. And it can be an order that has to be complied with right away. It can be time-based, and the inspector also has the ability to issue a stop work order as well, and that could be until something is remedied and fixed. An inspector can also speak to workers, supervisors, or the employer about actions that are needed in order to make sure that the company comes into compliance, or the worker, the supervisor comes into compliance with the act. So, although we're talking about prosecutions, there are alternatives to charges, and sometimes that approach is taken before charges are laid. And sometimes in the end, there isn't charges if the order is complied with. So if you receive an order, if you're an employer, for example, and you receive an order, it's important that you review the terms of the order and consult with legal counsel. We always recommend that because there is the ability to appeal the order. So you may feel that the order is inappropriate. It may not, the order may not actually make sense. It may not be something that you can do. There is a 30-day appeal period, and that's an appeal to the Labor Relations Board. If there's no appeal, and if you're going to comply with the order, then you need to make sure that you're submitting that notice of compliance to the inspector within the time period that is set out in the order. And it's important to, if you receive an order in the context of a critical injury, to look at the wording of the order and the references to what the inspector thinks the violation are. Sometimes that is clues that you can consider for the potential for charges later on. So if I look backwards from an investigation following a critical injury, if we look at the ultimate charges and then we go back and we look at some of the orders that were made, there's often a lot of overlap. So that's just something to take into consideration when you receive an order as well. Now, what to do after receiving a charge? So the charge it's issued in the form of an information, and then there is a summons that is provided to effectively the defendant. So once you get that document, it will have all of the charges that are against that particular defendant. So if it's the company, the charges will be set out there and described, and there may be particulars given as to the charge to help you better understand exactly the nature of the charge that has been laid. It's important to retain legal counsel if you don't have counsel, or if you have been working with counsel with respect to the critical injury investigation, for example. You want to make sure that you advise legal counsel right away. And some of the things that will take place after that, and that you, if you're the employer, can try to do, is to determine if any other individuals have also been charged. The summons that you receive will only have the charges against that particular entity, whether it's individual or the company. The information itself, though, will list charges against other people, and you won't get that initially, but it will be provided later on in the process. If there are other individuals charged, so for example, if a supervisor is charged, There should also be discussions about whether separate representation is appropriate for that individual. So they may need their own lawyer in order to represent them in the prosecution. And then something else that typically happens at that point in time is to gather documents and information to provide to counsel. If you have done a privileged investigation at the time of the critical injury, for example, if that's what the charges relate to, then hopefully the documents and information are readily available from that investigation. Otherwise, it's a little bit more time consuming to gather that information, which in the past was up to a year later. Now it's up to 2 years later, potentially as of July. So that does make it more important to make sure that at the time of the incident that you are gathering all the documents and information and setting them aside, ideally through a privileged investigation involving counsel, so that it is available in the event that there are charges that come forward down the road. So the next step in the prosecution process from a defense standpoint is to request disclosure, and that's typically done by counsel. The letter that accompanies the summons will provide instructions about how to request disclosure. Sometimes it's already ready to be provided once the letter and the summons is served, but sometimes there's a bit of a waiting period depending on how lengthy the disclosure is. But often it's ready or almost ready to be provided. As part of the disclosure process, the Crown is required to disclose all records in its possession or control that relate to the prosecution. And so that also includes making reasonable inquiries of other Crown agencies and departments. So for example, if the police arrived, then the police may have taken statements. There could be officers' notes. The police may have taken photographs. Now, often, when a critical injury happens and the police get there first, typically when the ministry inspector arrives, the police will turn over the investigation essentially to the ministry, and they will not do anything more on their investigation unless the police think that there may be criminal charges that may arise, in which case they may also continue a parallel investigation in addition to the ministry. And there was a question earlier for Brian, and I don't think he was aware of any situations where there have been Bill C-45 criminal charges and OHSA charges at the same time, but there have. So I'm aware of a couple of cases where that has happened. So there can be parallel charges. Sometimes in those situations, the prosecution of, for example, the OHSA charges are essentially put on hold until the criminal charges proceed. But those are discussions that would take place with both the criminal Crown and the provincial offences Crown to determine how those matters are going to proceed. But there can be sort of charges within both streams arising out of the same incident. So counsel will also ask for additional disclosure. So once you get the original disclosure package, as counsel, for example, I'll go through it in quite a lot of detail to make sure that all of the disclosure is there. I would say more often than not, there are things that are missing from the disclosure. So it could be that there are some, there could be a missing transcript from witness interview. There could be a reference in a note that refers to emails that were sent, and those emails may not be in the disclosure package. There could be missing information from the police, because sometimes, even though the ministry does make a request for the police records, sometimes they're held in different departments. And for example, it could be that the police photographs are missing because they were not included in response to that request. So making sure that all of the disclosure has been obtained is important, because we use the disclosure as counsel to assess the strength of the Crown's case and the potential for defenses. And that disclosure review can be a lengthy process because sometimes when I get disclosure, maybe it's about an inch thick, a couple of interviews, not very many documents, but it can also arrive in, well, it used to arrive in boxes. Now it's done more electronically. But if we were to print it all out, it could be boxes and boxes. There can also be a significant amount of video that also needs to be reviewed as well. So some of the things that we do as part of that disclosure, is, and also as part of reviewing the summons and the charges, is to consider if the correct entity has been charged. Sometimes, for example, a company may be charged as a constructor and maybe they're not a constructor. We look at whether the charges were laid within the limitation period. We also look at the charges and assess the Crown's evidence in light of the factual circumstances. Do we think that the Crown will be able to prove the charges based on the evidence that's in the disclosure? We also consider whether we think an expert would be needed if a defense was to proceed. Sometimes within the disclosure, we'll see that that the ministry has used, for example, an engineer. So there may be an engineering report. There may be an ergonomist report if there's an issue about lighting or surfaces or things like that. So we may need a defending expert in those circumstances. And then we're also looking just generally about what witnesses might be available to us in terms of helping with the defense, and what are the potential defenses that we might have. Now, defending against a charge, most offenses under the OHSA are what we call strict liability offenses. And so what that means is that the prosecutor must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the act that's subject to the charge. There's no requirement, though, for intent or moral culpability. Basically, the Crown just has to prove that, that factually the defendant committed the act that makes out the charge. So they violated the act, and they did those things. There are many forms of evidence that can be relied on. Could be witness testimony. So the ministry, when they're doing an investigation after a critical injury, for example, will often they'll interview the person that's been injured. They'll interview anyone who was a witness. They may interview supervisors, for example, or other employees who may have relevant information. They may interview a representative of the company. They'll also look at documents, ask for documents, and as part of an order, for example, at the time. Physical evidence may be important in the circumstances. So if there's a piece of equipment or a tool or something that is relevant, there could also be video evidence and also expert evidence that I referenced earlier. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about due diligence as a defense, but essentially it's where an accused has taken all reasonable care to avoid the specific event. That's the main branch of what we call a due diligence defense. There is a second branch, which is essentially where an accused proves a belief in mistaken facts that, if they were true, would make the act or omission innocent. And this one is very difficult to actually proceed with. So it very rarely comes about because it has to be a belief in mistaken facts, not a mistake in the law or a belief in the law. So you can't simply defend on the basis that you didn't know you had to do something or you didn't know it was an obligation under the act. And it also can't be a situation where you should have known those facts. So it has to be a reasonable belief in mistaken facts. So if we take the example of buried underground electrical cables. And so there is an incident that arises because, there's an excavator and they breach the cables, and, there's an accident that happens. So just because you didn't know those cables were there doesn't mean that you could use that as a defense in that case. So you would have an obligation as the employer to ensure that whatever locates or other procedures are necessary to determine and make sure that there aren't electrical cables if you're going to be digging in an area, for example. Other potential defense is officially induced error. And this is really where the government contributes in some way to the course of action. And this very, very rarely comes up because the government, in this case, the Ministry of Labor, does not put themselves readily in a position where this would give rise to a defense. So basically, you can't use this defense to say, you know what, an inspector was here and inspected the exact same workplace last week and didn't issue an order. So you can't use that to say the ministry must have thought it was fine, because if they didn't, they should have issued an order. That won't work, and that's not officially induced error. And the ministry, if you've read enough field visit reports, for example, the ministry inspectors don't put themselves in a position of declaring that something is in compliance. They will order you to bring it into compliance, and then they will receive your notice of compliance of you saying that you are in compliance, but they will not write back and say, yes, you are in compliance now. So that one doesn't typically come up as a defense. So we're really looking at due diligence, and we'll get into a little bit more detail about what that fully means later on. So the next step in the process, so we've looked at, for example, the summons, we've gone through the disclosure process, and we've reviewed the disclosure. Before there is a trial, there's an opportunity for a judicial pretrial. And that judicial pretrial will allow the defendant to learn more about the Crown's theory of their case. So at the judicial pretrial, there is typically a discussion about that. The Crown will start first by describing, the charges and the theory of the case to either the justice of the peace or the judge. It's also a chance to obtain further disclosure or get guidance from either the justice of the peace or the judge about if there are any disclosure issues that are outstanding. They're often canvassed during the judicial pretrial. And you can also get either the judge or the JP's view of what a reasonable resolution might look like. And that's an important part of the judicial pretrial, because it's important to know that, because at the end of the judicial pretrial, once that process has been completed, then the expectation will be, if there's not a resolution, that there will be a trial date set. Now, sometimes or I would say more frequently now than perhaps in the past, there have been continued judicial pretrials. So there may not be one. At the end of the judicial pretrial, if there is some prospect that further discussions will take place between the Crown and the defendant, then often it's put over for a continued judicial pretrial. And so the defendant is not necessarily forced to pick a trial date at the end of that pretrial session. Now, the Crown can also propose a Crown pretrial, and that's essentially a meeting between Crown Counsel and Defendant's Counsel to talk about some of these same things. Often that happens in advance of a judicial pretrial, but it could happen, in between, the first judicial pretrial and the second judicial pretrial, if there's going to be more than one. So Brian mentioned earlier guilty pleas, and that's an important part of assessing what's going to happen with the prosecution from the defendant's side. And, there are different considerations to think about. So it's really balancing the strength of the potential defense that could be raised, the cost and the time of defending the charges, because there is a cost involved. There's the legal cost, there could be experts' fees that need to be paid, and there's also the time and disruption for the employer, because the witnesses are often, there will be witnesses from the company. There may need to be other witnesses that are called. And so that's a consideration as well. And also the potential for a more significant sentence if you go to trial and you're not successful. In theory, if you're negotiating a guilty plea, you should be able to negotiate at least the certainty of hopefully a lighter sentence than you might if you went ahead with a trial, or at least not a more significant one than if you went ahead with the trial. And I often get questions from clients about, should we really be requesting the Crown's position on resolution? Doesn't that look like we think that, we would be found guilty? And my answer to that is always no. It's important to know what the Crown's position is. Agreeing to proceed to trial and getting past that judicial pretrial stage that's an important decision. And it's one that you need to make. If you're a defendant, you need to make that knowing what the Crown's position on a resolution would be if there was a guilty plea. And so some of the things that we're talking about are, at that point, are, how many of the charges would the Crown require a guilty plea? Typically, ideally, the Crown will accept a guilty plea on only one charge and then withdraw all of the other charges. Sometimes if there are multiple parties, so for example, if the employer is charged and the supervisor is charged, ideally, the negotiation will result in, for example, the employer agreeing to a guilty plea on one charge, any other charges against the employer being withdrawn, and charges against the supervisor being withdrawn. That is, I would say, becoming increasingly more difficult to achieve, but that's often the goal going into a negotiation with the Crown as to a guilty plea. And then also, what would the penalty be if there is a joint submission between the Crown and the defense as to the penalty? And when I refer to a joint submission, I mean when we get to the hearing where the guilty plea will be placed before the court, if it's a joint submission, then both the Crown and the defendant are jointly proposing what the sentence should be that the court should accept. But you can still have a guilty plea even if there isn't a joint submission on sentence. In that case, the guilty plea is entered and then there's a hearing only on the sentence portion. Now, the sentence is, in the past, has typically been a negotiation about what the fine should be. Although certainly I think there are signals that, whether it's at trial more than at the point of a guilty plea, but, there certainly have been a few cases, and we'll look at some of them where, the court has signaled that it's not just about money and that there should be something more than just money imposed as a sentence. But typically we are talking about what the fine amount should be. As part of Bill 88, I also wanted to bring it to everyone's attention that effective that same date in July 1st, the amendments also include now aggravating sentencing factors that can be taken into account. Now, in reality, many of these factors would have been taken into account in sentencing anyway, but now it's actually prescribed in the legislation. So death, serious injury, or illness, if the defendant was reckless, if the defendant disregarded an order of an inspector, if there were previous convictions, that's always been the case. If there's a lack of remorse, an element of blameworthiness somehow in the defendant's conduct, if it's clear the defendant was motivated by a desire to increase revenue or save costs, if after committing the offense, the defendant attempted to conceal the offense from the ministry. So for example, if the defendant changed the scene, so they did not secure the scene, if they moved things around, if they put a guard on something that wasn't there, for example. Also, if they failed to cooperate with the ministry or other authorities or any other prescribed circumstance. So that by prescribed, you mean something that might be prescribed in a regulation. So the trial, so if there is no resolution by the end of the pretrial, it will be scheduled for trial. It's typically before a justice of the peace for provincial offenses matter, unless the Crown elects to have the trial before a provincial judge. And Brian mentioned that earlier. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen sometimes. And sometimes it happens in the midst of the prosecution. So there could be a couple of appearances before the Crown makes that election. As a defendant, you don't have any control over that. It's entirely up to the Crown to elect to have it before a provincial court judge. Now, a provincial court judge, those are the judges that would hear some criminal cases. So, in many ways, at least from the defendant's perspective, having it in front of a provincial court judge is sometimes not as desirable as a justice of the peace, simply because provincial court judges aren't as familiar with, for example, the fine ranges that might be imposed. It may take more education of the provincial court judge because they're used to hearing criminal matters. They're not used to hearing provincial offenses matters. So at the trial, the Crown has to prove all the elements of the charge beyond a reasonable doubt. There's no discovery process like there would be in the civil context for the Crown to obtain information from the defendant about what their defense is going to be, for example. The Crown has to go ahead and prove they go first. They lead their evidence. There is the ability to request a directed verdict. So if, for example, the defendant doesn't think that the Crown has proven beyond a reasonable doubt all of the charges, then that request can be made. But otherwise, the defendant will then bring forward its evidence at the trial. And if that trial results in a conviction, and then there's the opportunity to make submissions regarding the appropriate sentence. So that's when, as a defendant, you would bring forward information about any mitigating circumstances, there would be evidence about the size of the corporation, for example. And as a defendant, you could, if you made all kinds of safety improvements, for example, after the incident occurred, that's something that could be taken into account from a sentencing perspective. And that's also the same when we're dealing with a guilty plea. We would bring forward that information to try and reduce the amount of the fine and to justify a joint sentence that's been agreed with the Crown. Brian did talk about the principles of sentencing. So deterrence, retribution, rehabilitation are kind of the main principles for sentencing. And then deterrence, there's general deterrence and specific deterrence. And in addition to those new aggravating factors that I mentioned that are coming into play with Bill 88, the court also considers a number of different factors. So size of the company, scope of the economic activity, the extent of actual potential harm, those maximum penalties that are prescribed by the statute. Brian mentioned earlier that, you know, the maximum is not something that is normally imposed, and that you know, that is reflected in the fine amounts. And you know, hopefully with the increase in the fine amounts, the maximum penalty will still not be the penalty that is imposed in most cases. Worker error is another factor that could be considered. Past safety record as well. Restitution attempts. So if there is, you know, if there are payments that have been made or things like that. Demonstration of remorse, correcting any health and safety issues, and even better yet, going beyond. So, you know, for example, for sentencing perspective, if this was, you know, a guarding offense, or, you know, or some other offense that, you know, it costs some money to fix whatever it was, you put a guard on the machine. You're not going to get a lot of traction for raising that as a mitigating offense. But if, for example, you went through your whole job site and you looked at all of your equipment and you had a consultant come in and you made changes that were more broadly implemented, then that's something that could be used to reduce the sentencing amount. Appearing in court in person is very important. And I always say to clients, you know, there needs to be a representative from the company at the guilty plea appearance, and the profit realized by the offense. That's another consideration. So what we see when we look at other comparable cases, when we're looking to try and figure out what is a reasonable sentencing range, we see a really broad range. And a lot of it has to do with the size of the company, because, you know, it makes sense that the point of deterrence, the penalty is meant to hurt, right? It's meant to sting. So, you know, if it's a small company, you can't impose the same amount from you know, the same financial amount of a fine as you would a larger company. It's going to take a higher amount to have it sting for the larger company. So we do see a wide range. And, you know, another significant factor is whether it's a first offense or whether it's a subsequent offense. And if the offenses are related, that's also taken into account. So some recent court examples. So this is a relatively recent decision just before the pandemic. It's the NUMEX decision. In this case, there was a worker with known epilepsy, and the worker had a seizure while working at heights. He fell to the ground and unfortunately he died. The worker was not wearing fall protection and had not received any health and safety training. At trial, the company was fined $250,000, and there were actually 2 charges. So there's a conviction on more than one charge. And the directors were charged in that case, and they each received a 25-day jail sentence and probation for 12 months. And as part of the decision, it appeared that the jail sentence was imposed because the court considered that because it was a small company, the fine that was levied against the company was really going to be paid by the directors themselves anyway, or was going to directly impact them. And so the court decided that they should have a 25-day jail sentence. Now, it was appealed a couple of levels, and ultimately the final decision was from the Court of Appeal. And the Court of Appeal held that the sentence was out of range of sentences regularly imposed, and that it wasn't necessary in this case for deterrence. And so this is where the size of the company is a factor, because in other cases, a $250,000 fine involving a fatality would not necessarily be out of range of sentences regularly imposed. And the fine in this case was reduced to $50,000 for the company, and $15,000 per director was a fine that was imposed. And the jail sentence was removed. And although the Court of Appeal, it was removed at a lower appeal level. And although the Court of Appeal didn't reimpose the jail sentence, the Court of Appeal did say they felt that a jail sentence would have been reasonable in the circumstances. Another case is Lafarge. It's the same time period from 2019. A worker died and falling through basically a walkway at a decommissioned cement plant. The company entered a guilty plea in this case, and there was a joint submission as to penalty where the Crown and the defense agreed to a $400,000 fine for the company. So, here we see a much more significant fine amount, but we're also dealing with a much larger company, Lafarge Canada, and also Lafarge had a number of prior convictions with fines in the past that had totaled $765,000. So I think there were, I think it was 3 prior convictions in this case, and some of them also involved fatalities. So although the fine was maintained in this case, so the court accepted that joint submission, there were comments in the case where the court basically said that the maximum penalty would be appropriate for a future violation. So, but here we see the court sending a strong message to the employer that that a similar fine would not be accepted by the court in the future, and that it would be much higher. And the next case is Vickman Construction. And then it's slightly later, 2020. This came out just after the beginning of the pandemic. And in this case, the company was convicted of 2 charges when a worker died due to improper use of a fall restraint system. The court actually rejected a jointly proposed fine of $125,000. And the court stated that a fine-only sentence did not achieve the core objective of the act, which is to prevent and mitigate harm in the workplace. And the court imposed, in addition to the fine, 18 months of probation, and also required the company to do a couple of things which were unusual. So to publicly acknowledge the offense in an article to be published in a safety magazine and on the Ministry of Labor website. There typically is a court bulletin that comes out that does describe the conviction and the offense. And the court also required the company to produce a safety training video for the ministry's website. So these were very novel and unusual additional sentencing requirements that were imposed at that time. Now, we haven't seen any similar cases, but I think we're definitely moving in the direction of courts being more willing to impose probationary penalties and potentially being more creative in the future. So that's something also to keep an eye on. So we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about due diligence. And I spoke earlier about the 2 different branches, the reasonable belief and a mistaken set of facts. And I'm really going to not delve into that at all because it almost never comes up. And then taking reasonable precautions to avoid a particular offense. So that's really about being able to demonstrate that the employer met the level of judgment, care, and prudence that would be reasonably expected of an employer in the circumstances, and proving that all precautions that were reasonable in the circumstances were actually taken. And it's very much fact-based and circumstance-based as to whether, as to determining what the strength is of a potential due diligence case. So it does take a fair bit of review and thought, in terms of deciding whether it's worth the risk of going ahead with the due diligence defense, or whether it makes more sense to consider a plea. And that's really because it's a strict liability offense, as I indicated earlier. So the bar for the Crown to get over is not overly high when it's a strict liability offense. So what kinds of things are due diligence? What can be helpful to proving a due diligence defense? So making sure that there are written policies, practices, and procedures. Although you may, as an employer, have policies, practices, and procedures, if they're not in writing, they're very difficult to prove and demonstrate that you have. Training and education, staying on top of it, making sure not only that people have the right training at the time they're hired, but that all certifications that they need to have, whether it's operating lift trucks or fall protection, for example, making sure that that's current, and really having a robust education program where your workers are receiving education on a regular basis, and it could be informally in toolbox talks or more formal programs where you're looking at, focusing on something in particular, lockout, tagout, for example, working at heights or ladders or whatever it is. It's also making sure that you have competent supervisors. So, you need to extend that training and make sure that your supervisors are also getting dedicated training, and that they're competent and they're able to actually carry out their duties as a supervisor. It's also monitoring and enforcement. So, regular audits, monitoring, whether it's by the site supervisor, for example, and making sure that records are being kept of all of these things. And enforcement also includes discipline for safety violations. So through that monitoring process, if there are, workers, for example, that are not wearing their PPE, then, there should be violations. There needs to be consequences for that. And all of that records need to be kept. Those things can help when it comes to a due diligence defense, because it shows that the employer is taking health and safety seriously, and they are trying to prevent accidents from occurring, and making sure that the health and safety program is not just in writing and sitting in a binder, in the construction office, that it's actually carrying through to what's happening on the site on a daily basis. And it's also important, if there is an accident, even if it's a minor accident, it's not a critical injury, there may not be any reporting requirements, that those accidents are being, appropriately investigated within the company, and that any reporting requirements are being complied with, whether it's WSIB, for example. And I can't say enough about the documentation, because if there is a critical injury and I'm called in to do an investigation, those are the kinds of things that I will be asking for. The ministry will also be asking for those things, because they're going to be doing an investigation. So the more you can do in advance to audit your programs, to make sure that everybody is following those programs, the better off you are going to be. And hopefully nothing will happen. But if you do have a serious accident and a critical injury, all of these things will help you. The things that I see that are not due diligence, so incomplete policies, those policies that get drafted and, never actually get communicated to the workers. Incomplete inspections. So there is an inspection form, but you know what? They didn't do it that day. Or so-and-so was sick. So, they never actually signed off on that. Anything that's incomplete is a problem. It will bring your entire process down if it's not actually being followed. If you're adopting sort of boilerplate policies and procedures that don't actually fit your work environment, that's not going to be helpful, because safety is specific. It has to be specific to the work that you're actually carrying out. It also has to be consistent within your organization. So, whether it's from project to project or from work team to work team, supervisor to supervisor, there needs to be consistency. So if one supervisor is, writing up employees who don't have their PPE, but another one is not, that's not helpful. It needs to be consistent. Under enforcement or failure to enforce safety rules is also a problem. Again, if your rules are written in the book, and even if it's part of your toolbox talks, but then when there's a violation, there are no consequences, that's a breakdown of your health and safety system. And then missing records. So, making sure that there's that there is a process for keeping those records, whether they get scanned, and they shouldn't just be in the supervisor's logbook. They need to be properly stored, for example, because what happens to that logbook if that supervisor resigns or their employment is terminated? You need to make sure that all the records are actually being kept centrally, and not just with individuals. And due diligence in the courts. There was an interesting case that came out in 2017, and it went to the Court of Appeal. A worker died after falling from an unguarded platform. Because of the configuration and the nature of this work platform, there was actually no guard that was required under the Act or the regulations. But the employer was still charged under the general duty clause for not providing sufficient employee training. The trial judge dismissed the charges because there was no violation of a specific OHSA requirement. But the Court of Appeal ultimately overturned that and found the employer was guilty under the general duty clause. So what this tells us as employers is that you can't just look at what the requirements are under the regulations, under the Act. You have to critically look at the workplace itself and the work activity that's being carried out, and look at that through a health and safety lens. So you may need health and safety protections, even though it's not necessarily specifically required under a particular provision of the Act or the regulations. And just a little bit more on record keeping. So make sure that, at your construction sites, you've got policies and procedures. Make sure that your subcontractors are signing in and you've got appropriate attendance lists for who's on site. That you've got training materials, you've got records of that, you've got records of your toolbox talk minutes, not just, and something as to the content of those toolbox talks. I'm always happy when I'm doing an investigation and I see that there's a regular schedule of toolbox talk comments or content that is provided to the supervisors or whoever it is on site that is doing the toolbox talks. We've got great attendance records. And so we can see that, fall protection was the topic of this toolbox talk. It was the week before the incident happened, or maybe that was PPE, it was right before this happened and somebody wasn't wearing the PPE. That's really helpful. It's not only helpful from a from a due diligence perspective, but it's also just helpful from a prevention perspective. You have to keep talking about health and safety in as many different ways as you can. And discipline records. Make sure that, if supervisors are giving out discipline, that there is some sort of a discipline form and that the records are being sent up so that they can be held in the office. And those daily logbooks, make sure that those are actually being completed and there's the accountability that they are being kept somewhere centrally. More on record keeping, so the orientation and the training, the daily safety checks, regular maintenance and safety inspections for tools, equipment, and vehicles. Those daily startup checks, if it's before equipment is being started up in the morning. Joint Health and Safety Committee monthly inspections also need to be kept. And notes and checklists from any audits or site inspections that are carried out. I talked about addressing violations. You need to make sure that they're documented and also to demonstrate that something was done in response to that to remedy the violation. And if it's appropriate, progressive discipline is typically the most appropriate response. And that can be verbal, written, can be a suspension, can be a termination. Typically it's progressive, but it doesn't have to be. So if it's a very serious violation, it could go immediately to a suspension. It could go immediately to termination. And you want to make sure that whatever the punishment is, it fits the violation. And just simply an across the board zero tolerance. It does not necessarily mean that you're going to terminate in every instance. You should be looking at the seriousness of the violation before you actually determine what the individual discipline is going to be. And just a note about subcontractors. So obviously in the construction sector, you're dealing with subcontractors. If you're the constructor, there may be lots of subcontractors on the site. Best practices are certainly to make sure that that you're providing your policies and requiring subcontractors to sign off. You're also collecting the subcontractors' policies and getting their sign-offs as well. You want to have a list of who the anticipated workers are going to be, inspect and copy any training records, collect those toolbox talk minutes that your subcontractors should be doing with their workers, conduct regular audits of the site and the health and safety practices of the subcontractors who are at the site. And you don't want to ignore or assume that the subcontractors are complying with health and safety policies. You need to stay on top of that. In the same way as if you're an employer, you need to stay on top of making sure that your workers are actually following your health and safety policies and practices. So just some key takeaways from the presentation. Frequent health and safety, self-audits, inspections, those written work instructions, training and strong supervision will help prevent injuries and strengthen that due diligence defense. One of the things that I see employers often falling down on are those written work instructions. So whether it's loading materials on a truck, anything to do on the site that workers are doing, hoisting, for example, you want to make sure there are written instructions that back up how you want workers to perform that work. I see often the case where there aren't written instructions, and looking back as we're dealing with a critical injury, it puts the employer in a much better position if there are written work instructions. And it's also possible that maybe if there were, it might have prevented the incident. The company should also contact legal counsel as soon as possible if there's a critical injury or other reportable incident occurs in the workplace. That's so that you can have a discussion and make a decision about whether to do a privileged investigation at that point in time, and just to get advice, even about whether if you're responding to an order from the ministry. And, you know, there are many steps in the prosecution process. So you want to make sure that you're working with experienced legal counsel. So the legal counsel, for example, who could be, you know, your regular construction lawyer who deals with construction liens, for example, that person may not be the right lawyer to deal with this type of case, even though they're a construction lawyer. So you want to make sure that you are retaining someone that understands the prosecution process, you know, and can provide you with the best assistance if you have to defend against charges. All right, so we're at the question phase, so I'm going to stop sharing here. And I think probably if Karen's going to say we should leave a little bit of time for people to get a chance to write things in the chat if they have any questions. So
Thanks, Lisa. Oh, we have our first question.
So great question. If a prosecution ends at a judicial pretrial, is that decision recorded and can it be used as case law? So the prosecution will end in really, well, one of two ways. So one, it goes all the way to trial, or there's a hearing prior to trial where there's a guilty plea. So if you go to the judicial pretrial and there are negotiations with the Crown about a guilty plea, there still needs to be a hearing for the court to receive the guilty plea. That won't happen at the judicial pretrial. It has to happen in open court. So at that guilty plea hearing, the decision will be recorded. The actual hearing itself, there will be a transcript if somebody wants to order it. And then there is typically that news brief that the ministry puts out after the fact. So there will be a public record, and it will be searchable typically on the internet, because that news brief will be available to everyone else. And it's also available. So when we're, just to complete that, when we're looking at, you know, what's the possible fine range to give advice to clients, we are capturing not only trial decisions, but also guilty plea hearings. And the vast amount of cases, those fines are coming out of guilty plea hearings.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Do we have any further questions for Lisa? Give it a couple seconds, couple minutes. Okay, and if we think of anything afterwards, maybe just send me an email and I can always shoot off a question to the presenter in the next, you know, if you think of something in the next couple hours or whatnot, I'm sure that they would be available. And at this time, thank you again, Lisa. I will call on Melanie to I'm sorry for the closing.
Thanks, Karen. So at this time, on behalf of the NCA and the Standards Safety and Education Committee, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of the participants who have joined us this afternoon for these very informative sessions. To that end, I'd also like to thank our outstanding speakers for today. So Michael Langlois from Langlois Training and Consulting Services, Ellaline Davies from Safety Works Consulting, Inc., Brian Barron from the Ministry of Labor, Training, Skills and Skills Development, and Lisa Bolton from Sherrard Coos LLP. So thank you guys. Some quick takeaways that I jotted down as I was listening to the presentations that I thought I'd share with you guys. I thought there was some really great statistics and numbers around the safety costs that that we see within the construction industry. And when Michael went over the 7 benefits of training, what really resonated for me is the one about decreased turnover. I don't know about the rest of you guys in the industry, but a lot of us are experiencing a shortage in skilled trades coming into our workplaces, as well as really good workers. So being able to keep those people in your workforce by training them and keeping them engaged and making them feel like you care, I think is a really big thing. So training not only shows compliance, but that you care about your employees. That came out as well. I also really like the great tips that Ella shared on dealing with obstacles with WSIB claims, specifically that making sure to have daily contact with the worker, documenting everything, and actually knowing that the Office of the Employer Advisor gives free guidance and advice. And with Brian's stuff, he shared quite a lot about charges and prosecutions, and the details about Part 1 offenses, and that those fines are already scheduled, and that Part 3 fines, they have, they're more kind of case law type items. And with Lisa, you shared a ton of great information on the other side of the prosecution table. And I really like the what due diligence isn't. That was something new that I haven't seen before. So thank you for that. So overall, what I heard is document, document, document. Training is really important, making sure that we prevent injuries and do a lot of training and inspections and kind of preventing the hazards to prevent the injuries and incidents, so that we don't have WSIB claims or go to prosecutions and have charges. So I hope that you guys enjoyed the sessions as much as I did, and that if you have any additional questions or anything that you'd like more information about the Niagara Construction Association or membership benefits, or even becoming a member of the NCA, please reach out to Karen. And thank you again for everything. So have a safe day. Okay. Thank you.